Hello, everybody. I'm Will MacAskill, and this is Tom Davidson. We're both researchers at Forethought, and this is going to be a conversation on the industrial explosion, a topic that Tom in particular has written about recently, and that we both think is highly underappreciated, both by the world at large and by people in the effective altruism community or those concerned by AI in particular. So let's get started.
Great.
What is the industrial explosion?
One useful way to frame the industrial explosion is putting it in the context of the intelligence explosion, which is a much more famous idea. So the intelligence explosion is the idea that when AI gets sufficiently good, it will get better than humans at making AIs even smarter. And that then those smarter AIs will then be even faster still at making smarter AIs, and we get this kind of feedback loop. And before long, we have kind of super intelligent AIs. But that's all in the cognitive domain. So that's all imagining AIs doing kind of things that a human could do on a laptop. But that doesn't say anything about the actual physical world. And the industrial explosion is basically applying that same concept, but to the physical world. So rather than kind of AIs writing smarter algorithms, which write still smarter algorithms, we've got kind of robot factories, which are kind of designing new layouts for factories, designing new processes for making steel, designing all parts of physical infrastructure to be more efficient, and then building a whole new generation of factories and robots and infrastructure, which is kind of improved along every dimension, which then itself then creates a new generation, which is improved along every dimension even more so. And so, again, there's this feedback loop of this kind of self-improving loop, this time of kind of robotics and all things physical. And the outcome is essentially the same, where you can have this kind of accelerating feedback loop leading in the end to kind of a very quick, rapid growth in kind of our ability as a civilization to do physical tasks.
The idea of the classic intelligence explosion is recursive self-improvement of AIs, designing and building better AIs that themselves are even better at designing and building better AIs. Yeah. This is the same, but for like a whole industrial base. Yeah. You have AI and robotics building better factories that produce themselves chips and robots that are even better than at producing more factories and so on. And so, okay, why should we care about this? Why should we be thinking about this idea?
I mean, it's going to be the way that we see the world around us be transformed. I think, super intelligence, cognitive alone, I think will have profound impacts. But to really change everyone's lives, I think you're going to need to transform the physical world. So, let's take, say, medicine, for example. If you want to, develop much better technologies that allow, amazing, people talk about, massive life extensions, solving things like cancer. I think that those types of technologies will require massive experimentation, and massive experimentation in turn requires, massive kind of laboratories for doing science. And so, if we want the kind of amazing benefits of AI, those benefits are downstream, ultimately, of physical experiments, which require a physical infrastructure. And so I think on the benefits side, many of these benefits that kind of people talk about when they think about the upside do require the kind of industrial explosion. But it's not just important for the benefits. Also, if you're thinking about strategic dynamics, like between the US and China, people talk about a race to superintelligence. Again, that the focus there is basically always on the race to kind of cognitive superintelligence. Who's going to have more chips? Who's going to have better algorithms? But you can again think, okay, what about the race to the kind of industrial dominance? And actually, the dynamics there are very different. And so, if you're worried about, one thing that's come out of thinking about this for me is I'm much more worried about authoritarian countries like China, kind of ultimately winning, the race to complete industrial economic dominance. Because if this industrial side becomes very important, they could have a strong advantage there.
Okay, great. I don't want to get too in the weeds just yet. I have a bit of pushback at some point on the benefits side, but the way I would have phrased it is a little bit differently, which is, okay, most people who are concerned about intelligence explosion dynamics are really focused on this software side, AIs improving AIs. But it's unclear, actually, if that will happen. It really depends on this hard to know parameter, which is basically you've got a fixed stock of compute, and then now your algorithms are getting more efficient. Is that sufficient to make the algorithms even more efficient and even more efficient again, such that you get this even with a fixed stock of computing power kind of
where in particular
explosion.
Once you've already made the algorithms more efficient, maybe you've plucked the low-hanging fruit, and so the next iteration of improvements are really hard to find. And that could mean that, you've got smarter AI searching for the improvements,
Exactly.
but they're still actually getting slower. And so I think, it's quite plausible. We get like a sizable acceleration. Maybe we get, 3 years, 5 years compressed into 1 year of AI progress. But that might not be enough to get us to kind of scary and super intelligence that would kind of upend everything. In which case, we end up in this world where the industrial build out becomes the kind of essential bottleneck.
Yeah, and to be clear, that is in fact your best guess view, is that, it's like 5 years in one or something, which is like big leap forward. And it's a big leap forward at the crucial moment too, which is when AI is kind of exceeding human ability. But it's still not the kind of classic picture from Bosley and Yukowski and others of a leap in the course of a year to like godlike superintelligence.
Exactly. And then that is kind of my median guess, but I will flag there's obviously tales where you do get, something that is superintelligence in a year. And there's also tales where honestly this feedback loop never really gets going, and you get like a couple of years in 1 year, and it's a bit like, okay, this essentially just allowed us to sustain the rate of progress that we had from compute. Compute scaling runs out. This algorithm thing kind of gives us a few more years of that. But, I think it really could be, a bit of a nothing burger. That's a possibility.
Yeah, okay. So the reason why we might not get a software-only intelligence explosion is that you've got this bottleneck, which is the amount of computing power you have. However, for an industrial explosion, there is no such bottleneck. Because, by assumption, we're talking about a wholly automated industrial base. There's robots doing everything. There's AI controlling the robots. The only possible bottleneck could be natural resources, which we can't make more of. But maybe we can go into that. I think it's very uncompelling that would be a sufficient bottleneck. But again, we could talk about that.
Yeah, and it's worth stressing, the software-only intelligence explosion, very unclear where that happens. I think there's a very robust case for there being some kind of intelligence industrial explosion when you can improve all parts of the tech stack, including the hardware tech, including, basic material science, and you can just build out the pure number of kind of parallel copies of the robots and the factories that you have churning everything out.
Yeah, maybe I'd put this in a slogan. It's like, everyone's worried about artificial general intelligence and the curse of self-improvement. Let's think instead about artificial general manufacturing and the curse of self-improvement of that. That's actually like a bigger deal because it's more likely to happen. The case is even stronger. Like the scale of it could be much larger, in fact, in terms of total output that gets produced. And perhaps even the peak speed at which we go could even be faster again. Yet it gets like less than 1% of the attention at the moment of the recursive classic like intelligence explosion.
So I think we differ a bit on this, where I think I agree it's probably doesn't get as much attention as it should. But sometimes I feel like you actually think this should get most attention or more attention than the software intelligence explosion, where like the big counter argument is just we will have more time to see it coming. I mean, that's not guaranteed with the industrial stuff. We can talk about, it could happen quite abruptly. Like certainly some people take that very seriously, but it is a lot more plausible that, okay, we literally have to be like massively ramping up our energy production across the board. Like people are going to notice that happening. And so I do think it's, there's a reasonable view, which is like, look, let's focus on the software intelligence explosion possibility for now. And then like, we'll see if that doesn't pan out. And then we'll have time to like pivot to the industrial explosion possibility. At least that's what I think we should be doing with like, the majority of our efforts. But there might be some things that we want to be doing to prepare for the industrial explosion now that benefit from lead time. And so I don't think it should be like 100%.
Maybe we'll get into this as well in terms of just how important it is to think about. But let's begin by just inhabiting more the perspective of what this industrial explosion actually looks like. So let's maybe just go with your kind of best guess, your median view of how the world goes.
Okay, awesome.
So yeah, we've had this 5 years leap forward in terms of algorithmic efficiency.
Great.
At the point that AI is automating AI R&D.
Yeah.
What happens next?
Very zoomed out, there's kind of 3 phases, and then we can talk more about each one. First phase is we've just had this big leap forward, and so now AI, is, I would say, probably at least as good as the top human at pretty much every cognitive task. Probably where we end up at the end of the 5 years, you could go into it, but one way I tend to think about it is like, okay, now AI can learn pretty much arbitrary cognitive tasks with the same sample efficiency as a human. That's also an easy baseline to reason about. But I think it's like a plausible place you land. And so that means, okay, maybe AI is worse at something still, because we literally haven't even given AI as much data as the humans had. But for many things, it's much better because we've given it more data. And even for things where we haven't currently given it the data, it's not too hard to get it a human lifetime's worth of data. So let's say, the people who work in TSMC, we could pay TSMC to kind of put cameras on their heads, record everything they do in-depth interviews with the kind of superintelligences, and parallelizing across all of that different data using other ways of generating data synthetically. You can probably get kind of human lifetime's worth of experience, 20 years of experience on the job, in less than a year. And so quite quickly, I think that in any kind of physical task, any physical industry of importance, we have AI that can kind of learn to be as good at that physical task as a human. And so if by this time we also have robots that can kind of, humanoid robots that could sub in for humans in any of these physical tasks, or very specialized robots that I think will also be very useful, then either way, the robots are able to match what a kind of top human expert can do. Like, probably by the end of this 5 years in one, or shortly afterwards, if we need to spend some time gathering the data. So what all of this means is we now have AIs that are, top human level at kind of all kind of physical tasks around the economy. We don't currently have loads of robots, but what we can immediately do is we can have those AIs instruct humans to do all the most economically kind of valuable and bottlenecking tasks. In this first phase, you could see kind of humans that previously were employed doing cognitive work, bankers, advertisers, all kinds of, people do at their desktops, might no longer, they could be immediately replaced with AIs. So, their labor is not valuable still doing cognitive tasks, but where their labor still is valuable is on the manual labor side. And so they could go into any parts of kind of physical production and be directed by AIs for like how to do all the different parts of that. And that gives us a kind of potentially fairly quick one-time boost in our kind of physical capacities as a civilization.
Yeah, at the high level, there's going to be these three phases. Yeah. Firstly, it's kind of retooling the economy where we've got the cognitive superintelligence. We don't yet have the robots to actually do things. Then second is building the robots.
Yeah.
Second is that the robots are able to just start acting, themselves. Who's actually built the kind of autonomous factories.
Yeah.
The third's then going to be atomically precise manufacturing or kind of nanotech.
Yeah.
First part, let's just inhabit a little more. So say that we get to AGI in early 2030s. The number of robots that we'll have that are kind of as good and general purpose as humans, my guess is that it'll be 0 for things that require like really fine motor skills, or it'll be maybe in the like tens to hundreds of thousands or something. Like that would be my kind of upper bound.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Like none of the robots are like there yet, and robot production numbers for humanoid robots are still like pretty low, like below 1 million, like produced ever. It's hard to know where they'll be by mid-2030s.
And so then there's a question of, okay, well now we have superintelligence that's like, let's just assume it's able to get really good robot designs, and suddenly the value of producing a robot is much higher because it can be controlled by superintelligence. So it's just able to put to whatever is most economically valuable. It's taking all of the, extremely optimal actions. And so there's a question for me of how long does it take? Because at the moment, we have this overhang. We have 8 billion. I mean, not all are like, able to be used economically, but approximately kind of 8 billion human robots. That is like quite a lot to scale to from a starting base of tens or hundreds of thousands of robots, where, here's an analogy, is like we produce 100 million cars per year. So if we were producing humanoid robots at the same rate we produce cars, then that would be 80 years before we just get to kind of 50-50 parity with humans, let alone to the point at which we get to human robots, like human bodies being a small fraction of all.
That's right. So there'll need to be a ramp up, but a very, very small amount of our manufacturing capacity is going to making humanoid robots, and humanoid robots will weigh a lot less than cars, like 10 times less. And so if it's kind of gram for gram, and you move car manufacturing over to robots, then you're immediately doing $1 billion a year. So it's not long at all then before actually most of your workforce, once you've made that transition, it's not too long before. I mean, we can get into the dynamics. I mean, it would then be 8 years if you switched everything over and just kept things constant. But in fact, we expect the doubling times for these robots to be pretty fast. And we can get into that such that yeah, within 5-10 years, we can get into the details. I think you're going to have loads more robots than humans.
Okay, but do you actually think it's still 5 to 10 years for this kind of retooling period versus maybe something much shorter? So like the thought is in this period, like, is it just we're extremely capital constrained because there's only so many factories that can be like repurposed for producing humanoid robots? And, obviously there's lots of humans that could build more factories, but maybe that's like too slow as well.
Yeah, so one way of calculating how long until the number of robots, exceeds number of humans is to kind of project the doubling times of robots over time. The basic way you can do this is you can say, okay, let's look at our current factory infrastructure. How long does it take? Let's say we take $1 million worth of kind of factories and physical infrastructure. How long does it take that to produce another $1 million worth of physical infrastructure? And it turns out if you look at kind of physical infrastructure that tends to make other productive machines and capital that could themselves be used to make more. Because there's some things we make are like buildings or are like theaters that aren't used themselves in production. So that's not the stuff to focus on. You want to focus on the factories that are in fact themselves making factories. If you look at those, it looks like it takes about a year for the kind of a factory to produce its own value. And so that gives you an initial doubling time of this kind of robot factory population would be able to double in a year. As it keeps doubling, the technology itself will improve. And you can, use what are called experience curves from the economic literature to say, okay, how many times do we have to like produce this robot infrastructure before we can produce it at half the price? And it turns out, it varies widely, but across the whole economy, the average is 3 times. So if you double, the idea would be once you've doubled the number of robots 3 times, their price halves. And so let's say we start off with a tiny number of robots, just 100,000. After 3 years, they'll have doubled 3 times, so it'll be on about 1 million. But now their doubling time
will be 6 months.
Will be 6 months. And then essentially you just kind of rinse and repeat that same argument several more times. So their doubling time is 6 months, but within another 18 months, the doubling time's halved again.
Yep.
And then within another 9 months, the doubling time's halved again. And if you kind of play forward these kind of shrinking doubling times, then you get that the whole thing goes to infinity within 6 years. So the kind of the first, and that's because it took 3 years for the doubling time to halve once, and then that's just half the time for the initial process because you then just repeat that same process half as long and then half as long again, and the kind of the infinite sum adds up to 6 years. And so obviously this is a toy model, but that is an interesting kind of angle on it because it's kind of saying no matter how many robots you start with, the kind of the internal mechanics of kind of super exponential growth could mean that you kind of hit whatever the limits are, within less than 10 years. And so that for me is like, okay, that kind of acts as a kind of bound on how long this could take. Like even if we don't start with that many robots, even if we never retool the economy, we just start with our like small, like 100,000 robots and ignore the rest of the economy and just have them kind of doubling. We don't retool all those car factories. We can still within 6 years get to kind of way more robots than humans. And then obviously, look, if we are bringing in more robots, then that's probably going to make it go faster. So that should kind of bring down our estimate somewhat. But if someone's saying, it's going to take us 10 years to retool the economy, and therefore take us 20 years until we've got 10 billion robots, then I would come back with a skepticism of like, well, that can't be right because there's this other way of doing it quicker that doesn't even involve retooling the whole economy.
This idea of experience curves, I think, is just very generally interesting and useful. So why has the cost of solar gone down by so much over the last couple of decades? as I understand it, at least a big part of the reason is just we're producing more solar panels. We're producing a lot more. And every time we produce more, we get better at making them. We just learn by doing. And that, in fact, follows this like remarkably stable pattern of exponentially decreasing costs given exponentially increasing rollout of solar power.
Exactly.
And so it turns out that actually holds true across all sorts of areas of the economy. And then you've told me, and I'll believe you, that on average, you need 3 doublings of output to produce 1 halving of the cost of the next kind of unit of output.
Yeah.
One question is that if that holds in general, why haven't we already had this kind of singularity of output in the past? So you've talked about, well, we have these factories that produce materials that and like tools that can be used for other productive users, including making more factories. And we're scaling up the output of those, presumably. Why hasn't that already gone to infinity?
We have, in fact, seen massive cost reductions across all kinds of physical infrastructure. The reason why the feedback loop hasn't happened historically is because the number of humans has been the bottleneck. And so you can't just keep kind of having factories make factories at the moment, because you would run out of humans to kind of run those factories, and humans are essential to kind of actually, making everything happen. But what's different about the scenario that we're considering is that human labor will now be automated.
Yep.
And so that's just another type of machine. So, a robot machine that's part that who that can be produced, that can be manufactured, and the technology for those robots can be improved. And so that's what changes the dynamics.
Okay. And so second thought is, you have this model, well, okay, the cost is halving every 3 doublings, and each doubling is approximately a year to begin with, so halving after 3 years. So you go to infinity after 6 years. But we're not actually going to start getting arbitrary amounts of increased output in finite time.
No.
2 thoughts at least. One is like, why is that not just a reductio of the model overall? And then secondly is, you made this claim that like, well, it doesn't even matter kind of how many robots you're starting with, because, well, you go to infinity in 6 years anyway. But if it's actually no, it's more like an S-curve and perhaps you go very fast, then it really does matter how many robots you've started with. Or at least that could make a reasonably big difference.
Taking the first point, why is it not a reductio? I think the reason why you don't go into infinity is because technology can't become infinitely good. There's limits to the amount of energy and natural resources we have on Earth, and so that sets a cap for how much physical capacity we could have. And then the way to incorporate that is to say, okay, there is some kind of S-curve. This process happens, continues for a time, but then it as it approaches a ceiling, it kind of levels off, and you no longer have those robot doubling times becoming any shorter, or you just kind of hit the resource limit and kind of you stop growing. And that's what I expect to happen. But I don't think the fact that the kind of simplified model that excludes the limits predicts you go to infinity means that the kind of adjusted model that incorporates limits isn't to be trusted. What was your second question?
Well, the second question was like, doesn't that fact then make it mean it actually does make quite a difference how many robots you start with?
So if you start with fewer robots, then that means that by the time you've got more robots, by the time you've got, let's say by the time you've got, 1 billion robots, the technology will be much better because you'll have been kind of doubling production more. And so the doubling times will be quicker. So in that version of things, in a way it's scarier, because by the time in fact, the robots are contributing equally to the humans, the robots are really growing very quickly. So it kind of zooms past us. If you're looking at total physical output, it would look like it was basically just the humans. Robots wouldn't be mattering. In fact, the robot contribution is rising super exponentially and then kind of bursts forth.
Okay.
We would see it coming, but that's certainly very different to if they're already 1 billion and they're doubling every year. Then it's much more at the point at which they're dominating the economy, it's still kind of manageable in terms of the pace of change. And then another thing to say is, if you are skeptical that doubling times could ever become as fast as a month or a day, then you will then, actually expect that if it does start on a small number, then maybe it does take a bit longer, because you won't believe me when I say the doubling times keep halving. You'll be like, okay, maybe they keep halving until they're 3 months, but past that it's crazy, and so that will then lengthen the amount of time.
Yeah.
Until we reach the Earth's physical limits.
Okay, terrific. I actually hadn't thought about this dynamic that, if we're starting with fewer robots, then it takes longer to get to the point of time that robots are surpassing humans in terms of the physical labor that robots are doing rather than humans.
Yeah.
But then the rate of change is much higher.
Yeah.
And so the point of time after that robots are doing 99% of the physical labor is much shorter.
Yeah.
Yeah, people often talk about AGI and then think, at that point of time, there's going to be this massive unemployment and, what is everyone going to do?
Yeah.
Whereas in this story, it's like, well, this is a chunk of time, and let's hit 6 years approximately, when actually employment is really high. Or at least, for those who want to it, and unemployment's normally defined as people who want work and don't take it. It's not that you're just, chilling out because you've chosen to. Because this is all unskilled labor. You have the AI. Yeah. I mean, people in the past would have found the current world dystopian. So you've got this AI kind of manager, and it's like, great job, Tom. Maybe it's gamified the whole system. You're putting together the robot hands.
Yeah.
It has a camera, probably from a phone.
Yeah.
That's seeing what you're doing. But there's this period when it's all humans could be at least employed, namely building robots. That's quite a different picture, I think, than people normally think when they're at the moment of AGI, there's going to be, wide scale unemployment.
Yeah.
Does that seem right?
I think that is right. I think, the value of this physical labor might be very high. If there's kind of an abundance of cognitive labor, then that kind of excess cognitive labor raises the value of kind of physical output, because they're complementary. And so, people might be kind of, payday for anyone who wants to do this work. I do think there's a question about how the returns to skill during this period, where just because you have a super intelligent AI coach doesn't mean that everyone will perform equally well. I mean, it does tend to be the case that AI assistance equalizes performance, but there might still be returns to being particularly strong, particularly productive, hardworking, obedient. So I don't think it's all labor will be equally valuable, but certainly if you're currently limited by just your kind of inability, by your kind of cognitive limitations, inability to figure out what to do, or you're limited by a lack of coaching, then certainly, that bottleneck will be relieved.
Yeah, another thing that people often say and think is well, AI will be driving enormous inequality.
Yeah.
Because capital ownership is much more unequal than even income inequality in the world is extraordinarily extreme. Capital inequality in terms of capital income is even more extreme than wealth inequality as well, because that's not including land.
Okay.
So it's wealth inequality is more extreme than income inequality, but inequality in terms of capital income is more
the
extreme
most
again.
Extreme.
Yeah. But this is a countervailing force where you've got this one-off period where income perhaps quite large wages goes to just kind of everyone in the world who has functioning hands, which is much more equal as a allocation of income than the world today, for example. And so that's at least one. Do you think that's right as a counter?
I think that's right as a first pass, and I would just add the qualification of, if you live in a part of the world that has existing factories that can produce the essential parts for robots, then your labor is going to be much more valuable. And my guess is that those kind of industries will be concentrated in countries that are already rich. If you live in a part of the world where the main thing people do is farming, then there's less going to be a factory process you can plug into to increase output. And there's also a bit of an unknown question about how many people in total will this whole thing be able to absorb. Again, because maybe we'll just be limited by the number of existing factories we have that can produce the kinds of things that we want to kind of feed into this whole process.
Although surely that would be temporary, because then we would build more factories so that we could harness the overhang
Build
of
more
human.
factories using what? We need
Yeah,
some kind of parts or materials that were produced by other factories.
Yeah.
So yes, we will, wherever possible, we'll repurpose existing factories and mining apparatus to kind of feed into building factories that people could work in to build robots down the line.
Exactly, yeah.
But
so rather than building the robots directly, you build the factory, because you need to build the factory anyway.
Yeah.
And rather than building the robots, you just build the factory. So because you've got all these humans just
yes,
hanging around already.
Yeah. But what do you need to build a factory? There will be some parts and some kind of inputs which themselves will be produced by other factories. And so you might just overall, the overall world might just have, 5 times as many human hands as it has physical factories that can feed into this process. And so I do think I haven't actually, run the numbers on this, but it's a bit unclear to me what fraction of the human population could be usefully absorbed into this process as a whole.
I guess I was just thinking, even if to begin with it's not, a massive fraction, there would just be this massive incentive to create factories such that, or create the physical capital such that you can make use of the human. Unless it's just extremely cheap to build the robots, such that...
No, I think you're right.
Yeah.
I would bet that you're right there, that, there would then be a period where... Because robots are quite high tech, they're quite far down. You can, for a given, thing that's produced, you can say how many layers of factories are there that go into it. And robots are quite far up the tech sophistication trees. Maybe it's you need to do 5 layers of factories before you can end up building a robot. So that's, if you're trying to do things as quickly as possible, you don't want to have to build a factory that builds a factory that builds a factory that builds your robots. You're going to be here all day. If you can just build loads of the first type of factories and then get all your humans involved to build the others, you can probably more quickly get to a really large number of robots.
And then just in terms of where the income here goes, you said rich countries.
Yeah.
I think it's more like middle income countries.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds plausible.
2 reasons, for this. One is that more manufacturing happens in middle income countries. Not all, so there's obviously a lot of car factories in Germany and Japan and the United States, but in general, going to be more.
Yeah, agreed.
My guess is that such countries are going to be more willing to have temporary immigration from even poorer countries, because so the middle income countries are poorer than the rich countries. So my guess is they're more likely to do, things that the population might not like very much in order to just get more economic gain.
Why would that be more likely? Just because they're poorer than the rich countries?
Yeah, exactly. Just because they value the economic gain more.
But why would they value it more than the rich countries value it? Oh, because £1,000 is worth more
exactly,
to you if you're worse off, absolutely. Okay.
Yeah. And then, but why not the very poorest countries? There you've got the cheapest labor. And the thought there is well, they really don't have the physical capital. And then also more likely to have just bad institutions where, you risk just, if you're investing, you risk losing. I mean, this is just a lot of the reason you've not got more investment in many of the poorest countries already, is because it's well, worried about losing the whole, you've built all of these robot factories and then the government just comes in and co-opts them or something.
There might be less kind of institutions for having reliable labor that you can depend on. And so if someone's choosing where to invest in building their next factory, they might favor a country whose economy in general kind of operates better. I do think there's a big kind of undetermined question of how much of the profits from this process, there's this massive gain from trade when you put this super intelligent labor paired up with this existing human hands and physical infrastructure in these middle income countries. That might produce a massive surplus. I think very underdetermined, is that surplus basically being captured by the kind of rich country that developed the AI in the first place, versus is it being captured by the middle income country? That will be important for what we might discuss later on about power concentration, which way that goes.
Yeah. In general, so you and I make a trade, there's some surplus.
Yeah.
My understanding is that economists don't have any very good explanation about who gets more of the surplus.
Yeah.
So if I've got a monopoly, then I get it all.
Yeah.
And then presumably if I've got something close to a monopoly, like brand power, or it's not like oligopoly, then I'll get more of it. But is there anything more general that we can say about who gets the surplus?
My understanding is it is just like seen as underdetermined by the economic facts. I think things like minimum wage, things like unions can like, they can be seen as kind of interventions to try and like nudge that surplus in a particular direction. But yeah, I mean the obvious question is like, okay, who is closer to being the monopolist? Where like one worry is, okay, it might just be like there's one or a small handful of US companies that control the AI, and maybe the US government can kind of corral them into coordinating, and so they can kind of act somewhat like a monopoly player, and they can kind of divide and rule, kind of bid middle income countries against us in terms of which one of you wants to receive our investments. And another dynamic, which I don't know if this is part of the economics literature, but it's if the kind of the people controlling the AI have this outside option where they can credibly say, look, you know what, we're just going to develop a new kinds of technology that kind of removes the need for this factory in the first place. Like we're just going to develop nanotechnology in a few years, so we don't even need you. And they can credibly, they can make that kind of option credible as an alternative, and that could kind of increase their bargaining power. Another thing is information asymmetries. So it might be that the kind of the actors with superintelligence have a much better idea of how valuable various kind of particular inputs are going to be to this industrial process. So they could like buy up those things for cheap, or strike deals with them where the other people who are making the deal don't realize how valuable what they have is. And so I think there are like a few dynamics here that could play in the advantage of the kind of rich countries with superintelligence.
That makes sense. Let's say now we've got the robots building more robots.
Right.
So Eric Drexler in Engines of Creation calls this clanking replicators. So we normally think of replicators like viruses or cells, but you can actually just have, it's like, and maybe it's not just humanoid robots. That's easiest to think about, but it's like, and it's not any individual robot, but there's this whole industrial ecosystem that is now able to replicate itself. Yeah. What happens there? Where your first pass, super simple model was, well, you get infinite robots in 6 years. Let's now make that like more realistic.
Yeah.
Just what does that look like?
So, in reality, it's not going to be a like click your fingers, now the robots are all doing it by themselves. There'll be like a gradual process whereby humans are less and less involved in the kind of robot replication cycle. To kind of like paint a simplified picture, let's just assume that the way this happens is that there's a special economic zone that the US kind of parcels out. Like, hey, this is going to be like the robot territory. We're not going to worry about, we're not going to worry about pollution or like livability for humans, insofar as we need to kind of like keep the human workers happy. We're mostly just like trying to go as quickly as possible, no red tape. What happens early on there is loads of parts and loads of human labor is kind of used as an input to the process to just try and build robots as quickly as possible. The robots might probably initially the robots aren't helping much with making further robots, because it's like all this kind of outside kind of investment is kind of doing the bulk of the work. But as the number of robots grows more and more, initially the robots might be pretty good at certain tasks. Maybe it's more repetitive tasks, kind of the tasks that you need less reliability for, so it doesn't matter if they make a mistake. And we'll hand off those elements of the robot building process, the factory building process, to the robots, but still have humans helping out on all the other parts. And then over time, the robots get better and more tasks, and you just have more of them. And so you end up handing off more and more of the process to those robots, and relying less and less on human labor, and relying less and less on kind of imports from the rest of the economy, because now the robots are able to kind of mine everything that they need themselves. So there's this slow process of a handoff, and then eventually you get to a point where you actually, the robots are so fast and so proficient, and there's so many of them that you actually don't need any inputs from humans anymore at all. And now the robot economy is just doing everything fully autonomously. There's a lot of uncertainty over how at that point, that you could pin that point of more or less it's fully autonomous. And you could ask how fast will it be doubling at that point? And I had this kind of very high level argument, but by analogy to how long it takes $1 million worth of factory equipment to create another $1 million, to say, okay, maybe with current physical technology, current kind of processes and kind of production methods that we use in mining and in factories today, we might be talking about a 1 year doubling time. But massive uncertainty bars, of course. There are kind of the bullish people think it could be a lot faster to begin with.
Yeah.
And there are some quite strong arguments. So the obvious one is, okay, but by now you've had superintelligence for a fair amount of time, and you've had superintelligence looking over this construction process for a fair amount of time. And if it's super intelligent, it's probably going to come up with some pretty big innovations. And sure, it needs experimentation. We're not saying pure intelligence can invent stuff in a box, but that's not the situation. There's loads of data, loads of chance for doing R&D. Maybe that's maybe that means it's actually 3 months because of all that, all the kind of innovations that the superintelligence can make. Now, it can only make innovations that use the same broad types of physical inputs and broad kind of physical components that our economy can already produce. So we're not here talking, that's going to limit how much a superintelligence could achieve here compared with if it could reinvent the whole tech stack. But there still might be room for some potentially significant gains. Another thing you can do to make this process faster is that these days we build things to last. Factories last for 10 years. Many kind of machines and cars and stuff, they're built to last many, many years. But in this new process, it's actually well worth having something that falls apart after a couple of years if you can make it twice as quickly, if you can make it twice as cheap, because then you can plug it in to this kind of self-reproducing process. And if it breaks in 2 years, doesn't matter. By then, it's already doubled itself, many times over. One thing these superintelligences might do is be constantly looking for how could we cut down on how long this thing is going to last? How can we make it cheaper? How can we make it kind of in some senses lower quality, so that we can kind of bring down that 1 year to be as low as possible.
Okay, yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And again, this point of just once things are growing very quickly, rational actors will be discounting the future a lot, because if I've got something that can pay off after a few years, well, that's just really not very valuable compared to putting money into the thing that is paying off immediately, because I can then reinvest it in the thing that also doubles every 6 months.
Yeah.
So it's as if, I had a bank account that is giving me a 100% rate of interest every year. And then you say, if that's true, then I value $10 in 10 years' time much, much less than if I was only getting 5% with interest every year.
Exactly. And when you build a car to last 10 years, the reason why you care about having that car in 10 years is because it's equivalent to $10 to you in 10 years' time. So if you don't value $10 10 years' time, you also don't really value long-lasting machines.
You started to hint at just how fast things could get.
Yeah.
And I think let's break open that box, because this is the thing. Already I'm imagining maybe heads are spinning, but this is where it gets really wild, is when you think just how fast could this kind of automated general manufacturing kind of double. And so let's first talk about, what are these kind of peak potential replication times, and why? And then I'll ask about, well, how fast should we expect to get there? Because I know some people who think we get there in a year. And so actually this 6 years from AGI to, or superintelligence to, whatever the limits of this process are, is actually quite a bit too conservative.
Yeah, potentially.
So let's start off with the kind of peak doubling times. We've got the robots building more robots.
Yeah.
That's getting faster over time. At the peak speed, how fast is it going?
So, the boring first pass answer is we don't know. And the second pass answer is, okay, but when we look at, plausible estimates for, what might be, what that might correspond to. It looks like extremely fast. And so the obvious thing here to look for is how fast do biological machines replicate themselves in the wild? And there's a range depending on how sophisticated a biological machine you're talking about. So on the kind of faster end, bacteria can like fully self-replicate in an hour. And you've got duckweed, which I think in a day can kind of double, under good conditions, plenty of sunlight, can double the number of kind of duckweed in a day. Then you've got fruit flies, which are kind of an interesting organism to consider because they do have small brains. And so we're thinking about, that might be one thing that we need to be producing here, computer chips. Fruit flies are kind of an existence proof of something that is that complicated, and they take a few days, less than a week, to double under good conditions. And then, something that's, a lot more complicated and that has clear kind of physical capacities are rats. And I think they can double their number in 6 weeks under good conditions. And, interpreting these biological kind of benchmarks, I think, is quite complicated. I don't think we can be like, oh, well, the fruit flies do it, so we'll definitely be able to do it, because we need to think carefully about, okay, what do these replicators need to be capable of? Obviously, if we just ended up with 1 trillion fruit flies, that wouldn't be very useful to us because they can't build anything, we can't direct them. So, obviously, the really naive interpretation of this is like, okay, you can make loads of fruit flies, so what? We need this, whatever we build to be such that we can direct it to build machines that build anything that's in the economy today. And so, it doesn't have to be able to build anything fancy, but it does have to be able to do, the very basic first step of making the tools that it can then use to then make slightly more complicated tools. And that could be a 100-stage process. The way you could do this is you first grow this kind of huge mass of fruit fly-esque kind of organisms that are more directable than fruit flies. And then the superintelligence has gamed out a way to kind of cajole those fruit flies into making the most basic tools that humans would have made thousands of years ago, and then use them to build the next iteration, and you kind of bootstrap itself to more and more kind of sophisticated types of technology. That's all to say that you need whatever we build to have some kind of physical ability to manipulate things in the world, and to be able to kind of receive directions from AIs, or kind of almost have the directions programmed into their brain so they actually go and they do the constructive tasks that we need them to do. And so you can then look back through the kind of benchmarks that I gave for the different biological organisms and say, okay, does it look like that could do it? And my own read is, look, if it's as kind of sophisticated as a rat, and it's been designed specifically so that it can follow instructions to kind of go and make machines to make machines, etc., then probably something as sophisticated as a rat would be sufficient. Bacteria, I'm skeptical. Obviously, maybe with nanotechnology it's possible, but it just seems like it's such a basic, limited type of organism. And then fruit flies, I'm kind of like, I don't really know. It just depends on so many uncertainties about what the technology will look like, and what happens with nanotechnology.
I've got various things to ask about this. So, in your view, when we're thinking about this, like the peak doubling, should we actually be thinking about very small robots? Or is it just a coincidence that the fastest growing biological organisms are all small? And in fact, there's this clear kind of correlation between how fast an organism can grow and how small it is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's coincidence. It's quite consistent across kind of biology. And there's also some, I think, pretty basic engineering principles which underlie it. So, I'll give a couple of examples. One is, well, they both come from surface area to volume ratio. So if, you want to gather energy, and let's say you're gathering it from the sun, or you're absorbing it from your environment, the nutrients just coming in through the kind of pores of your skin. Let's say you just double in all dimensions in size. Then that means the surface area of your skin goes up by a factor of 4. So you can get energy in 4 times faster. But the volume that you need to maintain has gone up by a factor of 8. And so you're going to be able to grow less quickly. And it's kind of less favorable in terms of kind of sustaining your sustaining all your operations. And indeed, we find like bigger animals, they have slower metabolism. And there are other similar things about kind of then distributing that energy. If you eat the energy, kind of making sure it kind of gets distributed to all of your cells. That again gets harder the bigger you are. For a similar reason, that the fact that the volume has gone up by a factor of 8. And another example is let's say you want to build an animal that can stand on 4 legs, and so you want its legs to be able to support the weight of its body. And then you imagine the animal doubling in size, again, all dimensions. So its mass has gone up by a factor of 8. So its legs need to be able to now maintain and withstand 8 times. Will they be able to do that? Well, if you hold all the materials constant, then the amount of weight that can be carried by a pillar is proportional to its cross-sectional volume, which has gone up by a factor of 4. So again, if you double the size of the animal in all dimensions, then it now weighs 8 times as much, but its legs are only able to carry 4 times as much. So it's kind of getting harder for this animal to operate. And
which is why elephants have these like weird kind of if you see an elephant bones in their legs, it's like all very compressed.
Right. Whereas ants, I remember I used to be amazed at what ants can do. Like, man, they can carry so much compared to their body weight. I used to imagine if there was an ant that was as big as a human, it would
you get all these
absolutely
facts.
Dominate.
Yeah, it could carry a truck if an ant was the size of a human. And another related thing is like animals can all kind of jump the same height, no matter how small they are. So like, look at how high can a human jump, can a horse jump, can a dog jump, can a squirrel jump, even can like a flea jump.
Oh, really?
Like, think about how massive the difference in scale is from flea to squirrel all the way to horse. Yeah. The difference in how high we jump is like not that high, not that great. And it's precisely for this reason. Similarly, the classic Google interview question of if you find yourself shrunk down to the size of an ant and you're at the bottom of a blender and the blender's about to turn on, how do you get out of the blender? And the answer is you jump out. Because if we were the size of an ant, we'd just be able to leap. At least it depends on how you set the thought experiment.
Very cool.
Okay, I want to push back a bit on firstly from the perspective of relying on these biological anchors for replication in ideal conditions. Because 2 things. One is that like these are always with ideal conditions.
Yeah.
So you've got the bacterium in an algae in a petri dish. It's got all the nutrients already. But like once it starts growing, you're soon out of ideal conditions because now it's like lacking resources. Yeah. And then secondly, growth is always when it's still very small. Suppose you've got this algal bloom and it's growing and growing and growing, but now it's massive. Well, it's not going to be able to double at the same size that it did before. In this case, you can think about it as 2-dimensional, but it's just the same phenomenon we've been talking about, where the surface area where it's able to get nutrients is the kind of shell of the algal bloom, which is quite small compared to the overall volume. And so even if it's able to increase still fast at that shell, that's only a small fraction of the overall area or volume.
Yeah, I agree with that. And with the case of rats and fruit flies, they're also making use of kind of processing that's already been done by plants when they're self-replicating. So like a lot of that work has been done. They're just picking up the kind of free resources that are lying around. Whereas in our case, these robots are going to have to, mine the fossil fuels or build the fusion reactors and the solar panels. And so that's another reason for skepticism. I basically completely agree. Those are reasons for skepticism.
I think one more argument for skepticism could be just, okay, look, so our brains evolved over like 600 million years. And, just in the kind of animal kingdom, I hope that's right. Whereas like cells, the things that actually self-replicate, that's over the course of 4 billion years.
Yeah.
And evolution evolution didn't have to do this in simulation. It was actually able to just run like physical experiments over all this time to find exactly the optimal machinery for replication.
Yeah.
Whereas in this scenario, we're imagining, okay, we've got like super intelligence. It's got like all of these like cognitive advantages, but it's not got 4 billion years to run experiments.
No.
in order for the argument to work, in fact, it's only able to run the experiments over the course of a year or two.
Yeah.
Why isn't that cause for, skepticism that you get to this point of having the kind of, very fast replicators before the point at which the slower replicators have already used up the overhang of kind of energy and resources that we have?
Yeah, I mean, there's two responses, neither of which I think are that convincing. First response is to kind of list out all of the awesome things that the superintelligences could do. And I do think, like, especially if you're talking about innovating towards, the very small, then your experimental feedback loops can become, very quick. So already you can, run certain kinds of biochemical experiments in, days or even just hours. And that can probably be made much more efficient if, you have a lot of effort to do so. Plus, wherever possible, building simulations to kind of model what's happening here. And obviously it's you've just got evolution had access to so much more trial and error. Superintelligence has some other big advantages, but it's very unclear whether these advantages will amount to this. So it's just a bit, I just feel like, okay, maybe. We don't really know. And the other argument is going back to the experience curves, where it is true that if you just extrapolate the kind of historically observed experience curves, even under more pessimistic, assumptions than what I gave, I said, 3 doublings to halve the price. But even if we did 5, then it does look like by the time you've reached the Earth limits, you're down to pretty fast replication times in terms of a few weeks. Now that also isn't fully convincing because maybe as you really start reducing the doubling time more and more, in fact those old experience curves break down. There's even more steep diminishing returns than they imply. I mean, those experience curves build in diminishing returns, but it could definitely be steeper. And so I don't feel like we have a rock solid argument for it's definitely going to be, doubling in days. I would be surprised if it was never doubling in months or even in 1 month. But, that's just my kind of looking at these different lines of evidence. And there's obviously a lot of subjective kind of weighing of the evidence going on.
And something I'll bring up, because actually I was quite confused by it earlier, is, back when I was more, because I started off very skeptical of, just general, this all seems quite wacky.
Yeah.
Kind of quite skeptical that we would get this.
Yeah.
And one thought I had was well, by the time that you're getting these replicators, the economy will already be kind of so large, there's not scope to grow.
Exactly.
And I hadn't appreciated actually how much of a kind of resource overhang we are currently in.
Yeah.
Where let's just look at energy, because it's just kind of easiest to measure and quite plausibly is the bottleneck. All of human civilization at the moment only uses the equivalent of 1/7,000th of the solar energy that hits the Earth. Even if we were just getting it all from solar and with 10% efficiency, let's say, then we could grow at, we could increase civilization's size by 700x.
Yeah,
700
and so
times.
that's going to end you with, 1,000 times as many robots as there are humans today, roughly. So that's, 10 trillion robots. Assuming the robots are equally productive per unit energy as humans are, probably you can make machines that are more productive in terms of physical capacity, especially if they're specialized machines.
That's what,
So you probably get, another order of magnitude from that.
Okay, so we're talking about a lot of robots. And then the second thing is that, Earth also doesn't limit the amount of resources we have, where then you can get another, even, take the industrial explosion that is now saturated, it's at resource limits on Earth, but then you can get a 2 billion-fold increase in terms of available energy from harnessing the sun by going into space. And so basically the thought here is just there are many orders of magnitude of scale up within just the solar system that the economy or world's industrial base can have.
Yeah.
And so that's this really long time in terms of scale up to be improving how fast you can go. And this again, I think, is an argument for why the industrial explosion's peak speed could go faster than like the intelligence explosion's kind of peak speed is the potential scale up, which is, maybe 12 orders of magnitude measured in terms of energy consumption, is like, it's really big. And so that's like more than weight. Like if you're accelerating with every step, the longer you've got to run, the more you're going to be accelerating. The faster you're going to be going at peak speed.
That's right. And, a lot of economists I speak to will kind of say, look, it's actually going to be a lot more gradual than you think. AGI will come a bit later. You'll partially automate things. It'll be ages before you have the robots. By then there'll be, other bottlenecks from kind of tasks that robots can't do or humans don't want human robots to do. And then human, kind of red tape will get in the way. And they then think that means that it will never go that fast. Yeah. But it's like, there's still these, 10 orders of magnitude. Like, what's happening to that overhang?
It's a great,
the economist needs to believe that we just eat through that overhang really, really slowly. And you'd need, decades and decades of just like any country could decide, let's go, let's do the industrial explosion, let's whiz through these orders of magnitude. And somehow the world doesn't. And it does feel, I think there's room for loads of, uncertainty about how much will humans want to go fast? Will we just kind of have loads of red tape? But it's hard for me to imagine that we never have a period where we go really fast, just because it's just unstable. If there's a technological capability to go this fast that isn't being taken, then it's like any arrangement or country that does kind of break out and start doing that just becomes very, very industrially powerful. And so it seems like it's very hard to imagine it never happening.
If you're responding to a quantitative argument with a qualitative point, it's very easy, especially if you don't like the conclusion, to then think like, oh yeah, but hasn't factored in X. Then you need to like make it quantitative, and often actually you can see that even on the most conservative estimates, this won't be powerful enough. So, okay, you were starting to hint on like whether we would actually want such an explosion.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but first, just on like the peak speeds.
Yeah. So
on the like slower than fruit flies side of the argument, we've got, well, evolution was able to do experiments, physical experiments for billions of years. Yeah. Fruit flies aren't actually all of what you want because fruit flies aren't controllable.
Yeah.
You are having to grow a brain, so it's perhaps not like programmable in the same way. Also, these like peak doubling times within these kind of ideal conditions with small numbers of the animal. And then on the actually maybe even faster side is, well, evolution doesn't understand the laws of physics. Evolution also doesn't have foresight. So, there are these vast, we talked about the energy hitting the Earth. In the seas, like most of the seas are like almost a desert, really, because they're very low in nutrients. A really clever evolution that was able to have foresight could have big pipes pumping nutrients into the seas and then have algae on the oceans.
Right.
And that doesn't happen because evolution doesn't have foresight. But superintelligence would. And so could instead have these kind of ecosystems where the nutrients or whatever raw materials are being provided and so on.
Yeah, I guess evolution was also bottlenecked by, it's only individual organisms that are selected for. So you can't get, if you can imagine organisms in this kind of bad equilibrium where they're all kind of selfishly grabbing, a little bit of the smaller pie, there's this possible reconfiguration where they all kind of coordinate, pump the ions to the surface and then give off some of the surplus to allow the people who did the pumping to benefit as well. But that doesn't happen because everyone is just kind of selfishly pursuing more of their own genome kind of being replicated. But that's again a constraint that we won't have.
Yeah. And also just path dependence in especially like use of materials and so on. Like you're not going to have an organism that's powered by something other than ATP, as I understand it. I'm sure biologists will give counter arguments. But you've got the fundamental building blocks that evolution is building everything out of.
Yeah.
Whereas, again, if you're a designer, like humans are super intelligent, you can pick in principle from anything.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the human brain might be quite an interesting example there because, people, will talk about, man, AI could think so much more quickly. It could kind of paralyze have the same kind of brain doing loads and loads of thoughts in parallel, could learn in parallel from all the data. So there's all these kind of massive efficiency gains we get because we're doing things in silicon instead of in kind of biology. And so maybe there will be similarly massive gains from as you say, using different hardware.
We've been discussing the case for and against whether superintelligence aided industrial expansion could have a peak speed of faster than or less fast than fruit flies in ideal conditions, which are a week, 10 days, doubling time. What's your actual best guess about how fast the peak industrial doubling time could be?
I'd probably put more than 50% on it. I'm tempted to say on it being faster than a day because of these arguments about the scale we'll have for experimentation, the kind of constraints that we won't have compared to biology, the kind of massive gains from specialization we'll be able to have that biology didn't have. Probably my best guess is that eventually, it is happening in like a day. Maybe that only happens once we're out kind of using the sun's energy.
Okay, yeah, I was going to ask, like, at what point?
But to be, this is like this seas of uncertainty here. You get a lot of ooms before you even go, a lot of orders of magnitude before you even leave
Earth. Yeah,
Earth.
Well, yeah, you get about 3 orders of magnitude.
Well, but you're also growing. Initially, you have fewer robots.
Okay.
So you. But I guess if you think about it, like actually it's the whole of Earth's physical infrastructure, then you've already got one of those. So then you're right. Then you only get 10 doublings. That's a more kind of conservative perspective. Yeah. Okay. Then I guess, if I had to give a median, I'd say probably you don't get it within a day while we're on Earth, but you do within the solar system.
Because one thought within the solar system is just sheer length of time to move things. We're used to movement in the solar system being extremely slow, where it's like, you want to go to Mars, that's going to take you months. But it could be much faster if you're willing to spend enormous amounts of energy accelerating very fast and then decelerating.
Yeah, so it could be maybe like you go to another planet and then it's kind of like on Earth where there's a lot of materials there and you can quite quickly replicate. Maybe you can replicate in less than a day for a bit, but then you have to go somewhere else to get more resources.
Yeah, I mean, my best guess would involve Mercury, going to Mercury, and then you're just like shooting out you're using solar power, shooting out materials from Mercury in order to form kind of a Dyson ring, you could call it, I guess.
Yeah.
But like all of these solar farms floating in the same kind of orbital ring as Mercury.
Yeah.
So it's kind of going at the same speed, but now it's just going all the way around.
Right, but once you've got that orbital ring, for it then to double, it's going to have to go and get
exactly,
materials from elsewhere. Or maybe it's going back. Yeah, it's going back to Mercury for even more materials.
Yeah, I was thinking it's just Mercury. Like, Mercury's orbiting the sun, then materials flying off the Mercury, maybe slowing down a bit, then accelerating again. So that's all in the same orbit.
Right, but wouldn't it be initially when you first get to Mercury, the fastest thing to do is just to tile Mercury with solar panels? And maybe that's really quick. Then you've got to start, you've used up all the sun on that surface. You've got to start send them. Eventually you just don't send them very far. Then you have to send them further and further. And so maybe your doubling time is actually getting slower.
That's right, yeah.
For that period.
So it's interesting that in the simple model just has this it's just this kind of smooth curve.
Exactly.
And this point actually might come up later in inter-country competition.
Yeah.
This kind of smooth curve. But actually it might be quite lumpy depending on various sorts of constraints. So when I'm imagining these really fast industrial build-outs, personally at least, I'm not imagining them happening on the United States land, unless it's on the deserts where people somewhere where if it's area that people don't care much about, that's more plausible. Or if it's a small amount of land, I'm like, more plausible. But then if it's like, oh, well, what about on the oceans? Again, it's like people might not really like the idea of kind of tiling the oceans with solar panels. But then when we're talking about Mercury, then I'm like, well, how much opposition will you get from the idea of building some massive solar farm on Mercury? Probably not very much. And so it becomes, in my mind, becomes even more plausible.
So in terms of the human bottlenecks, people not wanting stuff to happen, you're right. I would expect that because Earth already has all this infrastructure set up, that is a big benefit. And so you're sending out like a small amount of stuff to Mercury, then that infrastructure is not yet set up, and so you're kind of having to kind of lift yourself up by your bootstraps. That could actually be a kind of a slowdown factor in terms of like what's kind of physically possible. And so it could be that like it's actually like there's a period you first go to Mercury. Initially it's kind of tough because you don't have that much stuff. You don't have as much specialized machinery and infrastructure. Then you go really, really fast once you've kind of built up that base. So it's kind of like how Earth is. And then you slow down again. So yeah, different places will have different types of physical or human bottlenecks.
But your best guess is like on the order of a day, or like days peak doubling time, sounds like, at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for my best guess, I'd go a bit slower, like a week or something. But either way, it's like...
It's crazy, yeah.
I mean, it's like so crazy that, there is some sort of like... You get quite tempted to just think like, look, this is such a wild conclusion that the premises must have been incorrect.
Yeah, that is tempting. You can do the classic thing of, okay, but go back 5 billion years before life, or maybe when life was first emerging, and people, so surprised even at what kind of biological life was capable of, and the kind of crazy technological feats and doubling times that ended up occurring. And then, rinse, repeat how quickly then human civilization grew. And then after the industrial explosion, there is just this long-lasting pattern of things being really, really surprisingly crazy from the perspective of history.
Yeah, so one of these arguments is just, well, look at kind of economic growth or population expansion over history, and we've seen faster and faster growth rates over time.
Yeah.
Another example to illustrate that things can get radically faster than they have done in the past. And so this kind of outside view just assume the current rates of change continues. It comes from just the life cycle of kind of large stars. So stars that are at least 8 times larger than the sun, where here is like the process that each of the star goes through. So take a star that's about 20 solar masses, 20 times larger than our sun. For the first 10 million years of its life, it's fusing hydrogen into helium. Then the next stage is a million years where it's fusing helium into carbon and oxygen. The next stage is about 1,000 years where it's fusing carbon into neon and magnesium. Then there's a phase where it's fusing neon into oxygen or magnesium. That's about 1 year. Oxygen into silicon and sulfur is 6 months. And then the final phase where it's fusing silicon into iron just takes 1 day.
Whoa.
So you'd be watching the star for initially millions of years doing exactly the same thing. And then suddenly you've got this accelerating change.
Yeah, yeah.
I find this, it's not a direct argument. It's meant to be just like an illustration. But I often think about this as like, wow, looking at the world today and seeing a certain rate of change and then thinking, oh, it'll be exactly the same, therefore in the future, which honestly is just the natural way of thinking about it, I think is like enormously biased. Like as biased as if you were thinking, oh, well, there's this pile of sticks and the temperature is just increasing and nothing's happening.
Yeah.
But then suddenly it bursts into fire.
Yeah. It's very natural to do because across our lifetimes, that has worked. For anyone that was living, watching the star, it would have seemed like a pretty reliable way to predict the future. Like, through my whole life, it's still been, carbon to oxygen or whatever.
And the thought that it's like, the star is going to entirely change its composition over the course of a day.
It would have, probably
would have seen.
We'd have just been like, that's insane.
Yeah,
no way.
It's just literally
no way.
impossible.
We've never seen anything like it.
So let's talk about, what I'll call kind of demand side of things, where we've been talking about how fast the industrial explosion could occur, and talking about it largely from a kind of technological perspective. But in order to assess whether it will occur, you need to figure out, well, will people in fact want this? And so natural objection that economists could make is just, well, here we're talking about a world where you have enormous quantities of robots and AI in factories and so on. At some point, people will they'll have really had their fill. Each person has the million robots. And so instead they want something, whatever it is, that just can't be replicated in this way. And that, in fact, becomes the bottleneck. And you've already alluded to the kind of objections to this, but let's really
discuss it more. So look, if all we were getting is like more robot butlers and more widgets made by those robot butlers, then obviously we only want so many. Like, probably don't want 100 robot butlers in your house, and you probably don't want 100 different watches, 100 different cars. So yes, there would be like a point at which actually this stuff is doing more harm than good. We would just rather have more natural spaces than all these like additional machines clogging up our lives. But there are two arguments for thinking that there will be the demand. The first is that quantity produces quality, which is that if you can expand the industrial base, that will allow you to much more quickly reach qualitatively new and improved technologies. And one thing that people really want is to not die. And in the economics literature, there's these kind of models where as people get richer and as their lives get better, they want not to die even more because their life is so good. And so as people do become very materially wealthy, if this stuff is redistributed, then the thing that will then be the big kind of thing that they're worried about is, okay, but I could die next year. I'm getting old, and that my quality of life is getting worse. And what I expect is that if you can really build out this huge industrial base and just build, the next 1,000 years of technology, in 10 years, then that will then put you in a very strong position to then apply this kind of, amazing technology to solving, problems that really do impact people's lives, physical illness, mental illness, in the real limit, we could have a perfect understanding of how the human brain works. We could, sound sci-fi, but we could have kind of nanobots going into our brains and kind of altering the kind of the imbalances that are causing us to be depressed or to have other kind of mental health issues. And so, if I'm right that there will be gains to those kind of novel technologies, and that I think would be sufficient demand. So that's one argument for thinking this goes further, just kind of novel technologies. The other argument is competition. Okay.
Yeah, let's pause on that because this is an interesting case where maybe I actually disagree with you. And I'm not just playing devil's advocate.
Great.
So, okay, let's take a conservative estimate of how long this industrial explosion takes, which is 6 years. Okay, so I totally buy that as people get richer, then they want to live longer. Firstly, it's like empirically demonstrated. This is Chad Jones's paper, Life and Growth. Very good. But then also there's like two factors going on, because as you get richer, like within a year, your money has diminishing marginal utility. So you're able to get less good stuff per year because you've already got this really nice life. And the life that you're extending is also more valuable. There's kind of double whammy reason for that. However, I don't need to solve life, I don't need to solve immortality this year. This year, all I need to do is guarantee that I live to next year. And next year, I only need to guarantee that I live to next year, and so on. And if we're talking then about, okay, we've got this industrial explosion, like, especially now we're a few years in, the doubling time's like very rapid. I don't want to say surely at that point, we've got to the technological stage where we are able to basically guarantee for like almost everyone, that they're going to be able to like live that further year.
I wouldn't have thought so. I mean, yeah, that's pretty advanced, being able to extend everybody's life. You can probably get technology that will save some people's lives at a given level of technology. If we're talking about people who are pretty old, people who have like quite serious illnesses, then I don't see why early on in that process we'll have sufficient technology to solve their illnesses. I mean, especially as medical technology is something where the standard way of making progress on it won't really be accelerated that much by AIs, because it takes, you have to just like try things out on humans. It takes months and years to see if it works. So, the way that I see the industrial explosion getting around this is we develop kind of incredible nanotechnology, and then we kind of reapply that to kind of, quickly going through and understanding everything about how the human body and the human brain works. But that really is quite a very high level of technological sophistication we need to apply that. If we've just kind of got the clanking robots and now they're doubling in 3 months rather than in 12 months, I don't expect that to be sufficient. And I think we're going to be faced with a trade-off. Like, yeah, we could go slow. I don't think it's a crazy thought. Maybe society will be like, this is crazy, let's just go slowly. I think that's probably sensible. But I do think, millions will die as a result. And, probably will be aware of that.
So, yeah, I think a couple of things. One is that, these are years that we've got with superintelligence. A second is that we don't need to cure all diseases in this period, as long as you can just say, like, put someone into hibernation or like cryonics, and then that can punt you for a certain number of years. And then thirdly, like, let's assume this isn't happening in a democracy like the United States. Both, it's a democracy, so it's like, what do the majority want to happen? And in fact, the large majority of people will not die next year. People can also just take safer actions. Also, there's like, even if it's not curing a disease, like, we don't need to go as far as cryonics or hibernation, but also just, like lots of cancer drugs just extend life by a certain period, length of time and so on.
Yeah.
And also now people are like, oh my God, I'm not going to, all the like automobile deaths and so on, like, I'm not driving in this period, because like the cost for me of dying is so much higher. And there also is just this kind of, the dominant moral view is that death is not that
exactly
bad.
That's what I thought you were going to say. I think like the psychological of like, from some kind of rational perspective, it might make sense to want to kind of keep living. But I think many people have a kind of, the wise and sensible thing is to accept death and not to kind of try and fight it. Which, makes sense in an age where it's inevitable.
And I do expect that to change over time. So in 200 years, I expect people to look back and be aghast at the thought that we accepted death as this normal part of life rather than see it as a tragedy whenever it occurs. I don't expect that to happen
I agree
and be politically important.
Yeah, I find that objection the most compelling. There might be some people that really, really want this technology because they want to live. Like, maybe I think it's pretty plausible that the dominant societal narrative is like, look, this is, people die, get over it.
Say the world was just one country, the industrial explosion. And so, there was strong governance. So the country could, in fact, essentially choose its growth rate. We wouldn't grow at a rate of doubling, every few weeks. In fact, it would maybe be, I don't know exactly where we would land, but it'd be quite a bit slower than that.
Yeah, there's a question of where we would in fact land and where it would be optimal to land. Where my guess is you do want to initially go slow, but once you've got to a certain level of confidence in, AIs being aligned and the kind of the setup of all your societal infrastructure, that it will be possible to just, let the robots rip and then have them build amazing technology to save human lives without kind of everything going off the rails. And so there would be a period where it does go very fast.
It also, I think, depends on, again, where the expansion is happening, where if it's like, well, you can create the solar panels in space and you can either do that in a month or 10 years. It's like, well, I don't really see the case for saying only 10.
But isn't that also true in like kind of, Greenland, Antarctica, parts of the sea?
there are at least like more kind of, I guess, NIMBY concerns. Even for Antarctica, it's like protected by the Antarctica Treaty, and like there, okay, firstly, it's very, of all the places to put solar panels, it's really quite bad. But at least there's political wrangling because it's meant to be unowned by anyone. If we're talking about the sea, then it's like, okay, maybe you can do that in some places. But again, it's like...
Yeah, there's some wrangling, but there's going to be a lot of money, pushing for this stuff to happen. A lot of money to be made. And so I don't really expect that, with all, big US corporations lobbying the US government to support Antarctica and like no harms to anyone clearly resulting.
Yeah, let's say it's like using 10% of the high seas,
right,
with floating solar farms. That's still giving us many tens of times the total energy that global society currently uses, and I think people could get pretty on board with that.
Right.
I think let's move on because we both think the bigger consideration is competition.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and so obviously the competition perspective is, even if we wanted to go slowly, let's say it's the US and China, the US wants to go slowly, they also absolutely want to be, industrially, militarily, economically stronger than China. And, there's therefore going to have to be a kind of coordination to go slower than they could. And, I think what's interesting here is that it's not going to be breaking any international norms or seen as aggressive to just grow your economy. That is not typically something which is okay for the US to interfere in other countries. Like, oh, they're building up their industry, we need to get involved. Like that, the kind of current way international norms are very much like, if people want to grow economically, that's allowed. So it would have to be like quite a different attitude that kind of took hold in kind of international relations, where now like the US is forcibly preventing other countries from building up their own economies. Countries that are poorer than they are, absolutely in per capita. Even when the country that's doing that isn't doing anything aggressive at all.
I'm first gonna like strengthen this even more, and then consider the counter. With the strengthening even more, is like, because if you're just talking about the US and China, then I'm like, well, maybe they can just form their own little, binary global hegemon, but agree to go more slowly. But again, think about this like peak doubling time. As technology progresses, the peak doubling time, it goes down and down and down. And then eventually you're just looking at a situation where a single country or a single company could break from this global norm or global treaty. And then, if the peak doubling time is 1 week, have 50. That's actually literally not possible within the, solar system. Yeah. But within half a year has 25 doublings. Basically occupies the whole solar system. Could actually one country could kind of break away from the agreement and very quickly become kind of the whole of military power of the world economy. And that feels particularly unstable.
To prevent this from happening, you need to prevent any country from building up its industry at a quick rate. Because, initially all that country's doing is catch-up growth, just rapid catch-up growth. And then all it's doing is, getting to be still way smaller than the US and China. And so what you need is to, in general, just limit the economic growth of any country in the world. And that's quite a general thing to be limiting. It's one thing to be like, okay, we're going to try and control the flows of, high-end computer chips because it's important for AI, and that maybe can be done. But to be like, we're just limiting all economic activity. It's a very broad brush kind of restriction to be putting in place. I imagine it's gonna be quite hard to draw the line of what is and isn't allowed.
And I'll briefly clarify, we're sometimes now using the term economic growth strictly speaking, that's actually not what either of us are particularly interested in, because get into very hairy questions about what does that measure even mean when you're talking about an economy that's 100 times the size. Really, it's like industrial expansion, which is a proxy for military might as well, I think. Okay, so the underlying structure is obviously very compelling. One counter-argument is, well, this is, again, it's all post-superintelligence.
Yeah.
The US and China, let us assume that they don't want to grow at the literal fastest growth rate. They both know that.
Yeah.
They could just strike a deal where they agree not to do that. Okay, maybe that seems kind of weird from our perspective, but it's in both of their interests. Okay, how can they enforce a deal? Well, all of this activity is being driven by AI systems. So the deal could just be, we will verifiably to each other, show that what the AI is aligned with is a constitution that one way you could do it is forbids growth at a too high a rate. Or instead it could be like, well, it's not growth that we're actually worried about, it's the risk that we get stomped and maybe even taken over or, dismantled as a country by this economically more powerful country that can turn that into military might quite quickly. And so instead it's the AIs aligned with constitution that forbids that. Forbids the US from taking over China or something like that.
Yeah.
And so in this period, they'll have the option of making such a deal. And it'll be in both of their interests. And they'll have super intelligent AIs saying that it's in their interests. Like, why doesn't that happen?
And how did the deal get enforced on the rest of the world?
I mean, my actual belief would be that in this scenario, there's just some countries that are so powerful that they can just tell all the other countries that happens too. But you could just have all the deals get made on a country by country basis.
Yeah. I do think that the idea that there'll be a big deal post superintelligence is plausible. And maybe one thing it could contain is something like this. One thing I want to clarify is even if this deal isn't ultimately practical to last throughout, all the 10 orders of magnitude of expansion, I still think it could be pretty valuable to get a deal that lasts for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, as that could give us pretty important breathing room. And I think for those more moderate amounts of time, you don't even necessarily need a formal deal. It could be just global norms. If the US just doesn't really want to, let it rip industrially and just has a lot of kind of NIMBYism and red tape, and China does the same, and then maybe other countries just follow suit because there's this kind of one global culture. So I do think stuff like that is plausible, though would I think be temporary, but still very important. Yeah, in terms of saying this is, I guess you're making an argument here that it's actually quite likely to happen. I suppose my view is that the superintelligence will realize it's not really in the country's interests to not have this growth, because my view is that it is in fact in the country's interests to have very fast growth. So I guess the way this would happen is that the superintelligence is kind of doing what the people want, even if it's not what's best for them. So the superintelligence can just see, look, I know that this would save loads of lives if we grow much faster, but I can also see that you don't want that, and it's kind of a mistake and a bias that you have, but I'm going to propose this international treaty that gets what you in fact mistakenly want. Does seem plausible. I still have these worries about how you're actually going to enforce this. The AI sure has this constitution that says don't let too much growth happen, but who is it going to stop? If I want to go and innovate and do a startup, am I blocked? Personally, there's going to have to be some, in the details, a way of enforcing it. And what you're enforcing is just you can't make more stuff that everyone wants. So that's not to say it can't be done. Maybe superintelligence can do it, but it just strikes me as not the best way forward or something, very overly simple.
Well, the thought is that you can't make AI of a given level of capability. like you're not allowed to make you're not allowed to make AGI or anything superior to that unless it's demonstrated to follow, this kind of what ends up being globally or at least internationally agreed kind of specification, and that you've demonstrated.
But when you say this specification, I'm like, what is this specification instructed to do in the details? If I call an AI system and I ask it to help me do a startup, or I want to go and mine some materials, is the AI like, no, because you have to apply for the government permit for economic activity?
Let's start off with just the AI that won't go to war with China in the US, or vice versa.
Oh yeah, I think I'm on board with that.
Okay, but then there's no longer a competition, or at least one of this competition arguments has been removed, because China no longer needs to worry that if the US grows too much, then it will be able to militarily dominate it.
Yeah, I mean, so this does involve an intense amount of handoff, where like the US has lost control of its own military. It literally cannot get its missiles to fire at a given country, no matter how hard it tries. It can't dismantle the AI infrastructure and like build it all back, because the AIs will start, physically stopping the people that are trying to do that. So we're talking here about a very intense level of handoff. But I think there will be strong reasons to do that. I think this handoff is good and will probably happen too late. So I don't know how likely it is. I think the default thought would be this is never going to happen. Okay, most normal people would be like, no way will the US military literally hand off full control of all weapons to an AI system. Within a few years of developing them. It seems unlikely to me, although it's hard to know. Maybe superintelligence convinces everyone or something.
Yeah, I also agree that like psychologically it feels quite unlikely. Like, look at automation of other areas of the world and like handoff of decision making doesn't very often happen. Let's continue on the competition theme, but talk a little bit about the kind of period of the industrial kind of explosion.
Yeah.
Including kind of early stages.
Yeah.
Where it seems like the dynamics around who is likely to win.
Yeah.
So, again, contrast with the intelligence explosion. We talk a lot about the race to AGI. Is it going to be the US or is it going to be China? And at the moment, at least, it looks really quite likely that it won't be China that wins the race to AGI. Certainly not if it comes in the next 10 years. But now let's talk about artificial general manufacturing instead.
Yeah.
Who's going to win the race to that? And
yeah.
Keen for your takes. My take is that it's like becomes way more likely that a non-democratic country, and China in particular, wins that.
Yeah. I agree. If we start by analyzing the case where China and the US have access to equally good AI systems, then it seems quite clear that China has a few massive advantages. It's got a way bigger manufacturing sector. It's got way more human labor. It's got much more ability to kind of do infrastructure projects, less red tape, less NIMBYism. I think those are all pretty powerful forces.
And then an additional reason, which I often harp on about, is that authoritarian countries historically are able to save more than democratic countries are, where going back to, remember we were talking about robots, building more robots, but there's this question of the new robots that get created, what fraction of them get used to build more robots? That could be anywhere from 0, if the robots are instead being used as people's butlers and so on, or could be 100%, if every single robot's just building more robots. And historically, authoritarian countries have been able to maintain much higher savings rates than democratic countries. Because take the case of Stalin, he can say, I just want enormous industrial capability. So we're building factories that build more factories. People are going to have low quality of life in this period, but I'm Stalin, I can say that's how it's going. And that is in fact what was true for the USSR. Whereas in a democracy, people are like, no, I want to consume some of this output. That seems to me like a strong argument. There's one counter, but I'll
Yeah,
let
I
you go
think
first.
it might be strong, but I could also see a scenario where it's quite clear that there's this race on between the US and China, and everyone in the US recognizes that, look, I would actually prefer it if everyone was forced to consume less in the short term, because I don't want to get dominated by a totalitarian regime. And so maybe everyone votes for, supports a policy that forces higher rates of taxation and reinvests that in the kind of industrial explosion. I think the other dynamic to avoid would be one where people want everyone else to invest in the industrial explosion, but they actually just want to spend consume more in the short term. Where the kind of dynamic would be, well, I know that there's going to be infinite stuff in a few years because we've got this industrial explosion. It's the next few years where I'm really limited on my consumption, and so there could be a kind of a selfish incentive on the individual level to consume more. I guess just by analogy to wartime, it seems pretty plausible that the US would invest higher amounts, and especially if the industrial explosion is largely driven by investments from big companies. Companies are able to invest larger fractions of their output than average. In the AI sector, a very large fraction of revenues are reinvested.
Okay, and then an argument that Phil Trammell has put to me, though I'm not sure I will accurately represent him, is that, well, in a democracy, you're going to have loads of different, in USA, you're going to have lots of different actors, and some will reinvest at very high rates. In fact, I think it's true that Amazon, for many, many years, reinvested 100% of its profits. And so, okay, maybe maybe Xi Jinping decides to have a very high reinvestment rate, savings rate, 90%. But if in the United States just one actor chooses to have a 100% savings rate, then it will. That's the saving, that's the reinvestment rate, that's the growth rate that will drive the whole economy.
Yeah, and in fact, a few AI companies will be massively wealthy, and those are exactly the kind of actors that might reinvest, very large fractions of their output.
Yeah. So my response to some of your thoughts of oh, well, the US will reinvest more. It's well, that's plausible, but the question is, do they reinvest enough?
Yeah.
As much as authoritarian countries. And my response to this is that, well, would the US government allow private actor to become 99.9% of the economy? That seems unlikely to me. And especially allow them to do so without taxing them, where it's true that at the moment, reinvestment doesn't get taxed. But maybe that would change in such a circumstance, people really advocating for that. And so it's really then dependent on, does the US government itself just launch this program to, expand the industrial base as quickly as possible? A couple of cases for thinking yes would be, one is well, the US government is really worried, or the military, in fact, is worried by China taking over. So it has every incentive to do that. And then secondly, it's got, super intelligence able to kind of manage the whole thing. So some of the standard arguments for well, the government doesn't want to get involved in things because government isn't as competent as private actors, maybe don't apply to the same degree.
I don't see why you couldn't have, a group of dozens or even hundreds of companies going through the industrial explosion with high reinvestment rates. The government might not want one company to kind of dominate its economy, but it's definitely happy to have, dozens of companies dominating its economy, because that kind of already happens to some extent.
Okay, and maybe even if one company gets very large, well, it splits it up, but both of those companies still have high reinvestment rate, high savings rates.
Or it keeps it, but it kind of, integrates US government oversight. It's kind of semi-nationalized.
Yeah, I start to find things more plausible when the greater the degree that the US government is making this happen, or keen on it happening.
Yeah.
I mean, one thought is that I don't know if it's like 10% of actors weighted by, their economic power to begin with, that have this very high savings rate and others don't, then that's equivalent to the US just being much smaller than it would otherwise be, which, is therefore still
But
still something.
How much higher is the savings rate for autocracy? I thought it was a moderate difference.
It depends on whether you're looking at the periods of highest reinvestment, or like where the savings rate can be like 60% or something.
Oh, really? Okay, that's pretty high.
Yeah, versus just like on average where it's a bit higher, but I don't think it's like radically higher. And so, yeah, my argument was more about the capacity. Okay, putting this all together, I guess we do both think that, at least all other things being equal, this is like a advantage for
definitely all things equal. And then there's just a question of, will the authoritarian countries be on a par with respect to AI? Where if they're significantly behind, then that can make a difference. But if they're just like a few years behind, like it is at the moment, and then if there's like a software intelligence explosion, which 5 years in one and then it stops, then sure, the US will have a year where it's got super intelligence where China doesn't, but then China will go through that same software intelligence explosion. And then, it doesn't seem like the US has got that difference, a year different in capabilities. It's unclear like how much of an advantage that will be at that stage. You're now limited by your industrial build out. So I haven't tried to think through in detail, like comparing the prolonged US advantage on the cognitive side with the Chinese advantage on the industrial side. But zooming out, it's like the Chinese advantage seems really big. Intuitively, like much more than like a year would be needed for the US to catch up industrially. And so, yeah, that is a bit concerning.
Yeah, and I guess there's a factor that's relevant here where the further away it is that we get to AGI, then two things hold. One is that it's less likely that you get this extremely fast and very sustained software-only intelligence explosion, because we've learned that like each increment of intelligence improvement is like harder than we maybe best guess now. But then secondly, that's also more time for China to indigenize its semiconductor manufacturing. And so both of those factors compound to give, in China's favor when you're kind of looking further out. Because it means that the US has less of a advantage from hitting the software-only intelligence explosion first. Yeah, because that's less of a gain. And then secondly, China's less behind in terms of the key manufacturing, which is chips.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, is there anything more we want to say on authoritarianism and the industrial explosion?
I mean, one final thought in the US's interests is that market economies are efficient. They're good at allocating resources efficiently. So that will, tends to continue to be a big advantage for the US. Whereas like China has, a bit more of a mixed economy with more like top-down control over what investments get made and what companies, kind of flourish and don't. That if that continues, that I don't know how big an effect that would be, but that's like part of the reason why the US can have a higher GDP than China and grow more quickly.
And in particular, how big an effect is that in this post-superintelligence world? So it seems at least like the Hayekian argument of like, well, price is just aggregating all of these like little bits of information from everywhere. Well, you could instead just have the AIs aggregating all of that information. And so the whole economy acts more like a single very large company, where it's kind of this notable fact that like you've got these mega companies and they act like top-down central planning economies rather than markets.
Those companies will have problems with allocating resources because there isn't a market to say, is my labor within Amazon more useful on this project or that project? If Amazon was, in fact composed of lots of different companies trading with each other, then there would be some advantages in in resource allocation.
Well, if that's true, why isn't Amazon already, like, some companies have internal markets, but it's quite rare actually. Most companies are just
Yeah, my understanding is that there's a kind of trade-off between transaction costs on the one hand and the kind of benefits of efficient allocation on the other hand. So maybe it's that if Amazon had internal markets, then people just waste time kind of like searching for jobs and bidding for goods. And so that's the trade-off that makes sense. But on the US economy as a whole, there isn't just one company that does everything. Suggesting that it is useful to have loads and loads of different companies with price signals. And yeah, the argument would be that will continue to be the case, but it's kind of that doesn't really work as well in China because of the way it's governed.
I think it does still seem to me that superintelligence is really going to help a lot here, and especially when the goal is like, I want to increase my industrial manufacturing capability by as much as possible. That's like relatively.
But why does superintelligence make a difference? Because you could have a company now that's like, we just want to make as much money as possible. We want to produce all the inputs to the economy, and like we just want to be a one mega company. And it will just be the same, but you'll just be replacing the human employees with super intelligent AIs. So if it's not a more efficient way of doing it with human workers, why would it now be more efficient? Now you've got super intelligent AI workers.
Once you've got super intelligence, you can more easily transmit information like across this kind of like very large and kind of complex economy, especially in a case where like all of the AIs are kind of working for the same boss, like in an autocracy. And so this one argument for why markets lead to more efficient allocation, which is that prices aggregate loads of kind of contextual knowledge, seems to get weaker at least.
So the change is that the AIs are better at sending each other messages or processing information. And so you can kind of reconstruct some alternatives to the price signals in other ways.
Yeah, essentially. Like it's just able to identify like what works better in a particular area. I mean, in the most extreme case, maybe it's just like one huge model. It's like, no, it's not that there's all of these like little workers, buying and selling their robot parts or something. It's all just the AI hive mind. And like when it learns something, it just immediately propagates.
I guess I'm like, okay, but did anyone ever think that like, as people get smarter, markets become less useful? Or did anyone ever think that if people thought more quickly, markets would be less useful? And
I mean, the argument that like computers already undermine this argument for market economies is like quite common within economics. I'm not like, this isn't like some crazy will idiosyncratic position. And in particular, the analogy with like, well, we've got these huge companies like Walmart or something, employing millions of people.
Yeah.
And they do it without internal markets.
And maybe they do it because of information technology.
Yeah.
Maybe AI will continue those trends. The companies get bigger still, and it ends up being just efficient to just do everything within one big company. Okay. Yeah. Doesn't seem crazy.
Yeah. I think this is something you could dig into even more, though. And in particular, trying to think about the pathologies that authoritarian countries have too, where, I mean, again, maybe it kind of favors the authoritarian country compared to now. The dynamic I was thinking of is that if you have some dysfunctional part of the authoritarian country, that doesn't necessarily get killed in the same way as it does in the kind of market economy, because as long as you can pretend that it's not dysfunctional, or you're friends with your boss or something, then actually like it kind of just keeps going. Whereas, okay, now we're imagining an authoritarian economy, but they're all the same. They're just instances of the same AI, or AIs that are all aligned with each other.
Right, but if some of the AIs are actually helping some, party officials increase their relative influence over the economy, and are like extracting resources from some other productive process and just kind of giving it to some people, then I don't see why that wouldn't still happen.
I guess I'm imagining kind of more extreme situation where all of the AIs are aligned with, either the views of the party or just the kind of the wishes of the person at the very top.
Right. Yeah.
And then it seems like a bit of an own goal if they've set things up such that some more minor kind of party member can just extract.
Yeah. So I think what's going on there is the political and economic system is actually being significantly changed when you replace the current, ways of doing things with this new army of, obedient AIs to one person, so that some of those maladaptive dynamics no longer continue. Not because AIs mean it doesn't happen anymore, but because you've actually changed the relative influence of different factions and actors within the country.
Yes, but AI means that you're able to change the dynamics in that way.
Yeah, that's right.
Where, the market economy, it's like, well, you just use payment for aligning everybody's incentives.
Yeah.
And then like authoritarian country, it's like, well, you use some kind of more clunky system of like who does well in the party and so on. Doesn't work that well. But now with AI, you've got this new thing, which is just, you can just align the AI to be as you want it to be.
Yeah. I mean, the optimistic case would be actually, the other people within the CCP will have continued influence and power and will shape the deployment of AI so they don't lose out on their little niches of influence. And they'll use the existing bargaining power they have to do that. Xi Jinping doesn't have absolute power. In fact, it's, a careful balancing act. And so the hope might be that continues into the kind of post-AI world, and that, all the kind of inefficiencies continue. And also you don't have a massive concentration of power. I'm not like massively optimistic that will happen. So yeah, I do tend to think it will be quite easy for Xi Jinping to become a very powerful dictator if you wanted to. And then I agree, it might well be that economically then China's in a stronger position.
But even in the case that it's kind of a whole group, it's the select committee or something that is kind of in charge of the AIs, nonetheless, like none of them, they all want to avoid scenarios where they're having to lie about like whatever part of the economy they are responsible for. If there was kind of some gathering together of power into a select committee and AIs are kind of aligned with that, well, then they'll still just want the AIs to avoid these like weird maladaptive situations that China currently gets into.
Wouldn't a particular person on the select committee want AIs to continue to increase, his overall influence, maybe to the detriment of overall growth? And then there's a bit of a coordination problem over, are they going to all come together and actually get AI to do what's best for China versus...
Yeah, but it's not like each person's going to have their own distinctive AI. Instead, they'll all be coming together and saying, okay, well, this is how we're aligning all of the AIs.
I think people differ on that. There might be a whole kind of complicated ecosystem of different AIs fine-tuned and, prompted for different parts of the infrastructure. If each one of them can choose the prompts for the things that, he controls, then it's less clear you get that kind of perfectly coordinated outcome.
Yeah, I still feel pretty skeptical that, like, even if it's prompting, and then it's like, okay, so the other people, can they see the prompts? But okay, I guess no, it has to be hidden. Otherwise, they'd be able to tell.
It might not be hidden. I mean, people kind of know what happens. And, I think people within China are aware of the like somewhat dysfunctional dynamics. I mean, I think I would want to just better understand what those dynamics are, and then think if you introduce AI, are they likely to go away under various scenarios? Yeah, I don't feel like I'm sure they'll persist at all.
Okay, so just one last thing on this point about how AI might change the structure of the economy is a possibility that I find somewhat plausible and think people don't really think about is maybe there's just like basically one AI that controls the whole economy. So
as in different copies of the same
so every
set weights.
Take the current economy, sub out individual people, and instead it's all instances of that one AI. And everything that gets learned on the job every day by each one of those instances, then, this isn't how exactly I'd expect it to go, but at night, it all gets instilled into the weights. The AI just goes to sleep for a couple of hours every night, gets put into the weights, and then every day learns. And so it learns from every single interaction across the whole economy.
Yeah.
That's like quite a different way of like thinking about the economy or looking at it. And
yeah, I think I'm more skeptical.
Yeah.
Basic argument is just that they're against specialization. Like already you can distill like a smaller model that's like focused in a particular area and you can get similar performance much cheaper. And the bigger model is, more generally capable. But if you know that this AI system is in this particular economic niche, I think it would just be straightforwardly wasteful to have the most general kind of intelligent system do it. You've also just got some tasks are way harder than others, and so there might be a system where it's there's the kind of specialized AI that has the first pass. If it can tell it's quite a hard task, you kind of upgrade to the more and more intelligent AIs. But there's actually different AIs being called depending on how hard the task is to do.
I definitely agree that there's some things like calculators, like tool use. But I think I still want to defend this vision that even so, it would be more like, okay, you've got the whole economy and it's got all of these firms, but it's more like you've got instances of that one AI calling all of these different tools. And maybe some of the tools are like smaller, specialized AIs.
Bigger, smarter AIs.
Oh, interesting. So I would think that the ultimate AI is the biggest, smartest one.
Yeah, but most tasks are not that hard. So, for most everyday work in the economy, you're not going to need the smartest AI we have. You can make do with a less intelligent one.
There's a question, I guess, about just how much, like at the moment, my understanding is that we don't actually use older, dumber, cheaper AIs very much at all, because the smarter AIs are just so much better at the task that even if they're a little more expensive, it's worth it.
I think we distill AIs down quite a lot. Model
That's
distillation.
true, I guess, and it is the case that the distilled model isn't quite as good as the...
Currently, we're in a regime where AI can't really do anything autonomously, can't really be trusted. It's like pretty hard to insert it into any part of an organizational workflow for the most part. And so, yeah, I imagine currently most people do just want the smartest base model they can get. But, in this new regime, once you've got superintelligence, in fact, the smartest AI will be way more than what's needed for the task. It would be like getting in, a super genius to do some basic filing or something.
Lots of tasks in the economy do involve, new context and like some new scenario. And the gains from all of those AIs being like so perfectly coordinated and like, then being able to like distill whatever they learned back into the weights at night.
Well, I think those are separate questions. I think even if you're recording trajectories and then using them for training, I don't think that means you need it to be the same AI that was doing the activity in the first place. You could have, less clever AIs doing the grunt work, still record everything that happened, use it to inform the smarter AIs and the less smart ones. And on coordination, again, I don't think there's a magic thing where like if they're copies of the same model, they'll be, way better at coordinating. You could align different models to the same model spec, to the same behavior.
I mean, here's an analogy with learning is like, if I see you doing a task and then I try and learn from that, I learn like pretty well, but I learn a lot better if I do it myself.
And I think that might be fair enough. If the smarter AI would have not made this mistake that the dumber AI did make, then probably that training example won't be that useful to it.
Ultimately, you end up with kind of like the whole economy is more just like one company now with the one smartest AI at the top. and then some layer, and then like it's kind of managing, a lot of, maybe it's doing some stuff just directly itself.
Yeah.
And then is managing a lot of kind of less smart AIs or special tools or whatever. And then the thing I'm unsure about is like, okay, of all computation that's happening,
Yeah.
how much is the kind of smartest AI doing versus the dumber AIs?
Might be the majority computation, but the minority of tasks. And
Okay.
if it uses 10 times as much compute, and if it does loads of kind of chains of thought for some of these big strategic decisions.
Okay. But yeah, and like I didn't have a view on that because I'm not quite sure what counts as a task and how I'm like enumerating that.
Yeah. I guess I'm just thinking, look, you got robots on the factory floor. They're doing quite a specific part of the production line. I don't think we're going to have the AI that can also do amazing new R&D and conceptual thinking. I think we'll have a specialized AI that generalizes very well within the distribution of this factory and the situations it's ever going to see. And it can call another AI if something really weird happens and like offboard. But I just feel quite surprised if it's like, no, it's just like, Claude 9 doing all of this.
What about the particular argument of there ends up just being kind of one CEO of the economy AI versus kind of multiple distinct AIs competing? Because again, that seems kind of plausible to me because of kind of just economies of scale from larger models.
So yeah, there's definitely an economies of scale argument that pushes forward towards just having one big training run. So there's only now one kind of smartest AI model. We haven't seen that in practice yet. There's more and more AI companies over time. But maybe when it gets really expensive, in fact, it will only be the most efficient AI companies that can survive. And then you'll have fewer. I think that could go either way. And I guess you've been earlier in this conversation gesturing towards a different argument, which is that you think that kind of the benefits of prices in a market might diminish. And so there might also just be, Amazon could just do the whole economy now. And yeah, I don't feel in a great place to assess that argument. But, I will just say my understanding is that big organizations have a lot of difficulties in terms of managing everyone, aligning incentives. Obviously, a lot of those go away if now all the workers are replaced by like diligent AIs that are fully observable and fully motivated. But there's still this price aggregation, information aggregation kind of thing that's happening, and it's just not clear to me whether AIs will find another way of doing that without a market or not.
Yeah, I mean, there's also just other pathologies of large organizations because it's kind of surprising that any startup can outcompete these $1 trillion or companies, including sometimes on like the core products that the big companies are doing. And in some of those cases, like bureaucratization or misaligned incentives and so on, it's not clear that they disappear. Okay, I want to move on.
Yeah, let's move on.
One classic worry about the intelligence explosion is that it allows a single country, company, person, or AI itself to just essentially have more power than the rest of the world combined. Now, the question's like, is the same true for the industrial explosion? And let's just start off with the question of just whether a single country or company can outgrow the rest of the world. So if the United States gets to the industrial explosion, gets to this point of automated general manufacturing before China does, can the US just become 99.99% of the world economy and world military might and so on? Yeah,
exactly. So there's this kind of surprisingly clean economic argument for thinking it could happen. And it's as follows. Kind of step one is you need one country or company to become more than half of global economic output. Step two is that entity, let's go with the country example, kind of over time decouples itself from the rest of the global economy. So maybe, initially the US is 60% of world GDP, but it's still doing loads of trade with the rest of the world because, for example, semiconductor manufacturing is massively distributed. But over time, it's indigenizing all of those supply chains while maintaining its fraction of world output. Indigenizing will have some economic costs, but that will be paid by both parties. As it stops trading with South Korea and semiconducting, both parties leave out. So as it indigenizes, there's an economic cost, but it doesn't change necessarily the kind of fraction of the economy that the US is. And so the US indigenizes and indigenizes, and growth is already pretty fast, so it's maybe quite doable for the US to take these economic hits, because rather than like, oh, there's a recession, it's more like, oh, we're only going up 5% rather than 10%. So everyone's still pretty happy. Then you get to this point where now the US is still 60% of the global economy, and now it's also in fully kind of indigenous. It goes through this kind of trajectory of super exponential growth, which we've been discussing, faster and faster growth. Maybe initially, the fact that it's 1.5x as big as the rest of the economy means it's able to grow a bit faster because it's able to have more people doing more robots, more kind of AI systems doing research. But what the super exponential growth trajectory says is that kind of initial advantage will kind of grow over time. So let's say it's that initial advantage is like maybe it's a 1-year lead. The rest of the world would have taken a year to get to that same level of economic output. By the time things are doubling every month, then that 1-year lead is now an absolutely overwhelming advantage, because over the course of a year it can double 12 times. It can be 4,000 times as big as the rest of the world combined. And so the basic dynamic is it kind of has a fixed lead to begin with, a fixed lead in time, and then as the doublings become faster, that kind of time lead translates into a massive economic advantage.
Okay, fantastic. So I'll just kind of repeat that back because it's a pretty key point. So supposing you and I are two different countries, but we're both growing at the same exponential rate. And let's say you're twice as big as I am as an economy. If we're growing at the same rate, then you'll just always be twice as big as me.
Yeah.
We don't kind of change position. However, suppose that now we're not on an exponential growth trajectory, but instead a super exponential one, like a hyperbolic one that we were saying before, where the rate of growth is itself increasing over time. And this is what it was like in the robot doubling case, where you're doubling every year for the first few years, but by the time you've hit 3 years, you're doubling every 6 months. After 18 months after that, you're doubling every 3 months, and so on. Well, now it's the case that if you and I start out where you're twice as large as me, and we're on the same technological trajectory that is driving to the same kind of economic growth path, but it's an hyperbolic one, then the fact that you are twice as big as me now, which you could also think of as being like a little bit further ahead, means that over time you get indefinitely larger than me. Because with your larger economy, you're able to double a little bit faster than I can double. And then after that, you're able to double a little bit faster again. And so you just accelerate away from me. And that's kind of like underlying reason why this, faster than exponential growth dynamic, hyperbolic growth, would seem at least to structurally lead to concentration of power into the hands of kind of one country or whatever the relevant kind of unit of economic actors are.
Exactly. And indeed, during the Industrial Revolution, growth sped up globally. And the countries that were leading that, in particular Britain, did in fact grow, a lot faster than the rest of the world for a fairly prolonged period of time. And its fraction of world GDP went up by a factor of 8, from 1% to 8%. So we have seen this play out to a lesser extent historically.
And you gave the example just of Britain, but if you look at kind of Western Europe as a whole, it was really kind of economic and also just scientific backwater
Right.
in, let's say, kind of 1100 AD. And then, so, only a small percentage of
Right.
global economic power. And then by 1900, Western Europe and its kind of colonial offshoots was the large majority of economic power.
Right.
But either way, it's, like if the key fact is just over time, if one country is growing faster than another, or one group of countries, they are going to, over time, completely dominate. But then you're also pointing to this kind of countervailing force, which is trade. So in the case of industrial revolution, trade is like fairly slow. We don't have telephones at this period. However, when we're thinking about this case of your country and you're twice as large as me, and we're both going along this tech trajectory, if we're trading all of the time, then I'm getting some fraction of the kind of gains that you're getting from your new technology. And that's bringing me along with you. Is that the idea?
So there's the case of trade is complicated. There's two things that you might want to separate out. The first is that when we trade, there's some kind of gain from trade which could be split. And as we've discussed earlier in this conversation, it's kind of underdetermined how that is split. So you could imagine a kind of trajectory where I'm like, look, I could outgrow the world by myself. That's my default option. I'm going to trade with you, but you're getting a tiny fraction of the gains from trade such that I'm still going to end up at 99.99% of, world GDP. You will also be a lot richer than you would be if we hadn't traded. And you should accept my deal because, you're going to end up the same fraction of world GDP as if we weren't trading, but it's just we're both going to be a bit richer. So it's definitely possible to have continued trade, but still have the outgrowing the world dynamic. But another thing that in practice happens with trade is technological diffusion. So in practice, if we're trading, then that means I'm selling you lots of technological artifacts. I'm giving you machinery which you use in your country and which you can then understand, and then you can have your own companies, start building that same machinery.
Yeah.
And that kind of catch-up growth has been a massive factor in overall world growth over the last 100 years. And so like after World War II, you can see Japan, China, South Korea all grow much faster than any frontier economy ever has done, because they are trading with these frontier economies that allows them to get exposed to these massively advanced technologies which they can then much more quickly produce and adopt. And so in practice, when countries trade, and one of them is much further ahead technologically, it does seem that in practice, we don't get this kind of splitting of the surplus where like the leading country keeps almost all the surplus and keeps its relative position. In practice, it seems like it's, often the case that the laggard country is able to actually benefit disproportionately from the trade that happens. And so there's a narrowing of the gap from that effect.
Okay. And my understanding is that in these cases of, the tiger economies of Taiwan, Singapore, and China, and so on, actually most of the gains from globalization and international trade have come from ability to kind of copy frontier technology rather than the mere gains from trade.
Yeah.
Like those would still be large, but actually a small fraction of
I think much larger is just the copying of the existing technologies.
Okay. Yeah. And so the thought here is that actually there's a limit to how far ahead the frontier country can get, because I will just be able to copy. At least if you're trading with me, I will be able to copy.
The reason why trading is hard to avoid is because, at least at the moment, countries have lots of individual companies which want to make money for themselves personally. And any given company within the US can make money by selling to foreign markets. They can sell their technology to China. They make a lot of money, and we're seeing this with NVIDIA. And that might not be in the interests of the nation and the nation's attempt to be as much of world GDP as possible, but it's in the individual company's interest. And as it makes them richer. And so to prevent this dynamic, I think we would need to see a kind of concerted effort top down from, the US government to be like, okay, no trades with the rest of the world unless we're like really making sure they can't copy the technology.
You've definitely phrased this in terms of just not trading, but trade where you can't copy the technology, especially perhaps post AGI,
Right.
might be much easier. So like take all like services or kind of intellectual services where I just make a request to the American company and they have a million AI workers kind of figure that out, but then send back the output. I'm not getting access to the AI, certainly not the weights, and not the training, process.
Although,
and so on.
If the service also allows the client to see a chain of thought, then then can become training data. And so I believe that part of how DeepSeek, got the capabilities they got was training on the outputs of, frontier models.
Training on the outputs. It didn't even need the chain of thought.
Right.
Because it didn't have access to OpenAI's chain of thought.
Yeah.
I think.
Okay. That sounds right.
The case I'm thinking of is that I'm paying for the output from some large use of AI labor, some good or service, rather than the AI labor directly. So maybe you've got to restrict the kind of frontier access to kind of AI chatbots.
Yeah.
But instead you can buy the goods and services.
Yeah, so I agree with that. And that might be a direction things go in. It would be, it would mean companies can't make money that they would otherwise easily be able to make, which would be quite a big shift.
Yeah.
We've struggled to get export controls against China, despite some, people pushing for it. And the case for export controls on high-end chips is a lot stronger and more direct, I think, than the case for like, oh, you can't, see the outputs of these AI systems. So, I mean, I think I agree with you that what you're saying is technologically feasible. My claim is just it would require like an unusual effort from the government to make it happen. And, with physical technologies, it's harder still, because as far as I can see, you just need to stop them from being sold to the laggard countries, because if those countries now literally contain those physical technologies, then they can be disassembled.
And we're in a scenario here where we've now gotten to AGI, or something in between AGI and superintelligence. There's this huge overhang, like we were talking about before, just from like existing physical capital, like car factories, from literal human hands that could be building things. And again, we'll assume that AGI got developed in the US.
Sure.
The companies are like, oh my God, we can make so much money by exploiting this like overhang of resources and bodies and physical capital. And the government's like, no, we're going to go it alone so that we can dominate the globe.
Yeah.
And you might think, oh yeah, that's actually not that
likely.
Not likely to happen.
Yeah. And so, there's different, knobs you can fiddle with here in terms of how likely it is to happen. So one we haven't discussed that much is just kind of on the merits, how concentrated versus distributed the industrial explosion will be. So I think, we'd be mostly assuming it will be fairly distributed. The argument being there's all these human hands, there's all these kind of existing factories across the whole globe. Surely the industrial explosion is going to benefit from using them and upgrading them with AI systems. But there is a possibility that instead you get something more like superintelligence quite quickly develops entirely new technologies so that the old machinery is less useful. And there's the special economic zone in the US that's just very quickly, having this new technological stack kind of self-replicating itself. And maybe, then there's kind of less kind of schlep from having to negotiate trades and transport things across the world. And so if there are like lots of kind of bureaucratic hurdles to, actually upgrading factories across the world with AIs and actually getting people to follow these AIs instructions, maybe for various, complicated reasons, that just, there's just a lot of friction there and it takes a while, but you can actually get this special economic zone going with zero friction because you're just really pushing for it. You could see a more concentrated industrial explosion happen. And so, that's one input into how likely this is to happen. To the extent that it's concentrated, obviously it's more likely that the US would be able to outgrow the world. To the extent that it's distributed, then there'd be a massive economic cost to all those US companies from not investing abroad.
Okay, so in this special economic zone scenario,
yeah,
I guess what I'm imagining is that there's this leap from AGI to somewhere like superintelligence. And then either because the AI is very good, it's more like through superintelligence, or it actually turns out to be easier to make progress on like robotics, nanotech, than one might think. That actually you can just kind of immediately go, or near immediately go, to just self-replicating factories, perhaps they're very small, like the kind of fruit flies that we were talking about.
Right. Exactly.
And the government sees the importance of this, and so says, just in the desert of, Nevada or something, just let it rip.
Yeah. Maybe there's $1 trillion investment to buy in all the specialized equipment from the rest of the world. That then kickstarts it. And then after that, you don't really need, human hands or factories elsewhere.
So even in that case, it seems to me like, man, there's still this huge economic loss from all of this wasted capital. Because it's like,
right, you could still import that technology and build it in other countries.
so either the kind of growth, that like very rapidly growing technology, or just, okay, there's going to be some use. So like, people will be willing to sell their labor for, a very low wage. If the factories are otherwise just being wasted, then they're gonna...
Right. So the argument would be potentially the AI cognitive labor is just better used in the special economic zone.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't got infinite cognitive labor. The special economic zone is the thing that's really paying dividends because it's the new tech stack. We'd actually just rather use our cognitive labor here than sell it to other countries. It does seem improbable to me. There's just such big gains from specialization. Even if there's a new tech stack that's being quickly developed, I still don't see why it wouldn't be kind of simultaneously developed to many different locations. So I don't, I lean fairly strongly towards the distributed end of the spectrum, but it's just worth flagging that, other researchers disagree on that one.
Yeah, and there could be an argument from, in this world, we're leaping ahead to very advanced robotics, therefore probably very fast doubling times. So the US might be saying, look, for 6 months, we don't understand this technology. We don't really know what's happening. We're kind of worried about stuff leaking out. We're going to just keep this on US soil for now.
No API calls that are received from outside of the US.
Yeah. It becomes more plausible if it's like, well, this is this few-month thing, and it's given a particularly transformative leap from AI to superintelligence or atomically precise manufacturing, which makes it much more believable that the US might do very drastic measures.
Yeah, so I do think the way this happens is top-down. And I guess that's I was previously thinking the top-down motivation would be to economically dominate the rest of the world. You're saying, like, there's this other motivation of, like, this is just this crazy, scary new technology. Like, we don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's just kind of, like, play it safe for 12 months. And then by then, we've already kind of outgrown the rest of the world.
Yeah, where I find it, at least in the United States, somewhat, but not massively, psychologically implausible that the leadership has a goal of like, no, we want to be 99.99% of the world economy, rather than merely being, the biggest.
Agreed.
However, the psychological motivation of, man, we don't even know what's happening, maybe we'll lose our number one spot, is much more plausible to me.
Yeah, I think the motivation of, like, we want to beat China, it's clear that if we sell this stuff to China, then that will help them, is more believable. Harder for me to see kind of all Western democracies being cut out, but you could have a situation where China and other authoritarian countries, they're not given access, and then it's kind of a alliance of many democracies that outgrows
Yeah.
the rest of the world collectively.
Yeah, I can see that.
Whether this happens, one kind of variable is how concentrated versus distributed the industrial explosion is. Another important one is whether AI is a monopoly within the leading country. If there's just one company that has superintelligence and, maybe they bought up all the chips, or they've come into the government to shut the others down, or they've kind of hacked into them and kind of sabotaged them in some way, then now that company has a monopoly, and, it has every incentive to like extract monopoly rents. And so then you could end up in a situation where it is in fact selling its services across the globe, but it's structuring it in a way so that there isn't kind of technological diffusion. Because, in the same way that the US government could imaginally have this goal of like, oh, we want to like outgrow the world ourselves, the AI company could have this goal of like, well, obviously we like want to capture as much profit as we can. That's our mission.
Yeah. I think that's a great point regarding it being a monopoly. It seems likely that there's not going to be loads of frontier AI companies.
Yeah.
So it'll actually be more like an oligopoly. Let's say there's, a few of them.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem that hard for such companies to coordinate to restrict what they sell outside of the United States. I guess they've got to do it internally to the United States as well. So what I'm wondering is, like, even without there just being a single country that's leading, actually, okay, there's 2 or 3 companies. They and the US government all share the same aim, which is having a cartel on frontier AI. Why don't they just do it and coordinate? And again, my kind of memory from the economics of oligopolies is that actually in practice they
do it a little bit.
They end up looking quite a lot like monopolies.
So if you take the government out of it, then the AI company's incentive would also be to do this within the US. So they'd be extracting monopoly rents from every US business. And so you'd have an industrial explosion, but where basically the AI companies own all the profits from it, or maybe even own the companies doing it, because they've just structured those transactions to kind of get the gains from trade. But that would still happen worldwide. There's no reason that those companies, absent government involvement, no reason why those companies wouldn't want to just use all of the kind of infrastructure that already exists across the globe, and get the benefits get all the gains from trade themselves.
But they would lose from the diffusion of the technology.
Okay, yeah.
So what I'm imagining is company A and company B, the CEOs are just on a call and like, hey, we're going to fix prices and this is what we're going to do. They do that because now, why do companies not do that normally? Well, because it's illegal and the government will stop them. In this world, the government wants them to do it. And so I'm imagining they are aware of that.
So they're price fixing, but then they're also like, we're both building these robots, and like, we kind of don't want anyone to steal our robot technology, so we're going to like very carefully structure the way that these robots are rolled out across the US economy so that no one else can steal the robot technology. I mean, at this point, it does feel like it's quite hard, because like any other US, person or company could like buy some robots, deconstruct them, use AI labor to like start their own robot company. So at this point, the companies now need to start being like, also, AI, when we're training you, don't ever help any other company develop new technology, especially like don't help them with understanding the robots that we've built. And they could put that into the constitution. I think people would find out that this was happening within the US economy, and everyone would be like, okay, so OpenAI is literally like, trained its AI not to help people develop rival products to its line of robots. Like, it seems like it would be like pretty bad and wouldn't go down very well.
Yeah, I'm going to keep
great.
defending this for the bit. So it's like, okay, people are in uproar.
Yeah.
They're like, this is a violation of antitrust.
Yeah.
It goes to the courts.
Yeah.
3 years is how long, many years is a typical antitrust case.
Yeah.
And they're doubling the industrial base. Let's say it's every few weeks or months.
Yeah.
I think if I were the company, I'd be like, well,
that's fine. We've got plenty of time.
We've got plenty of time, yeah.
No, yeah, I mean, the law was not built for situations like this. I think that if the US government wanted to stop it, they could and they would. So it feels like the critical question to me is like, okay, what does the US government want to happen here? I think I agree with you. Look, if the US government is like on board with a few companies capturing all of the profits, then then it could happen. I would have thought the US government wouldn't be on board with that, because they would rather have, a balance of economic power. That's kind of typically good for the government. So there's no kind of one rival entity that emerges.
If there's many economic actors, then it's much more likely the technology leaks out. And so they actually have this unusual strong argument.
Yeah. So
perhaps they tax the frontier companies a lot more.
Right. So they need to ban the frontier companies from selling their robots to other countries. Why can't they just ban everyone from doing that? Allow the technology to proliferate, balance of economic power within the US, but just no technologies invented after 2030 can be sold to other countries.
So where we were, I thought, was that, yes, that's one way that things could happen.
Yeah.
But even without the US doing that, maybe that's what you get, because the companies want it too. They want to do that. They want to do the special economic zone thing.
Okay. I mean, if the government's, really competent, then it seems like it's better for the government to just ban the selling of the robots for everyone, and then have kind of no, distribution of economic power within the US. And then the government's other option is not ban anyone from selling robots, allow this kind of oligopoly to develop, and the oligopoly will just choose not to sell. So that could be like, if the government's kind of incompetent, they realize this is happening, but they realize okay, I guess this will protect US interest, and maybe they allow it to happen because it's
and just in general, I think it's more likely that the government will permit something, permit a bad thing, or permit this concentration of power or monopolistic action rather than deliberately take action to.
Yeah, I agree. There's this massive overhang where either of these companies could make a lot more money in the short term if they sell their technology abroad. And so, but they're not doing it presumably because they have the goal of being a large fraction of world output. Is the thought
for the two companies, no, I'm thinking that they make, it's like a prisoner's dilemma for them, but they both make a lot more money if they don't defect, because they retain monopoly pricing over what they're producing.
Maybe. I mean, in the short term, I think that if they both sold to the rest of the global market, they could make more money. They just sell more. But in the longer run, then competitors would emerge.
So you and I are the two lead companies, and we're in cahoots and we're charging monopoly prices. If you defect, then I will also defect. And you know that.
Yeah.
And okay, now we have to just pay the actual kind of efficient market price, or sell at the efficient marketplace, because we're now competing down the price. Yeah. And that's just predictably worse than both of our perspectives.
Yeah. So there's kind of, you can sell to the rest of the world at a monopoly price, you can sell at the kind of competitive price, or you can just not sell at all. And I think we need that third one to avoid the technological diffusion. And it could happen, but I think it does require both the companies to be farsighted, because they are giving up revenues in the short term. Because even if they both sell, if they both just sell at monopoly at high prices, then they will both make more money than if neither of them sell in the short term.
Yeah, so I guess it depends on how much money they can make just them selling things at monopoly prices where there isn't technological diffusion, and how much they can make from selling ones where there is technological diffusion. And it also depends on how quickly does that technological diffusion happen. Because if it takes a year and they're doubling it, 3 months, it's maybe not that big a deal.
Yeah, and if other countries don't have their own advanced AI, then they can probably sell the robots and just deny the other countries access to AI systems, and then probably the technological diffusion can't happen fast enough. On the other hand, if the other country, if China's got somewhat pretty good AI, it's only a little bit behind, then selling the robots is harder because it could quite quickly lead to diffusion.
Let's back up a little bit. We had this underlying argument for if a country's a little bit ahead, it'll like speed ahead even further because it's super exponential growth. But then trade and tech diffusion will keep the laggard close to the leader. And so then we had this kind of discussion of, well, will the country want to pay a kind of what may be a one-off cost in order to keep the laggard further behind? And so I'm curious on, your overall take on how likely that is, including kind of if the US is the leader,
Okay, so if the US is the leader, then I think the modal scenario is one where there's multiple companies that develop superintelligence, with a few months of lead, but not enough lead to like quickly outgrow the world. And my modal expectation is that those companies will be allowed to sell their AI systems on API calls to the rest of the world in the same way that they can today, because that is just the strong default. It would be pretty unprecedented to restrict that and require. And obviously there's a logic that could be taken on to do it, but in the short term, I think that stuff will be sold, and therefore we will see a distributed industrial explosion. Now, I do think that the US is going to be pretty aware of China. And it's pretty plausible that the US will limit to some extent the technology that is sold to China. And then especially once this kind of industrial explosion really gets going and it becomes easier for the US to kind of stop, to kind of maintain good growth while still somewhat internalizing and like reducing dependence on China. I think I guess my best guess would be that does happen, and that kind of US plus allies end up pulling ahead of China to a significant extent. I don't know that it will be 100% like zero trade, but I imagine it will be enough that like, okay, China is like significantly diminished compared to today. I don't think that means that the US or even the US plus allies is going to be 99.99% of global output. I don't think you need to take the logic to that conclusion, but I do think this would be a force that notably increases kind of US plus allies and somewhat increases the US within that as a bright star. And so I do think there'll be a significant concentration of economic power within West plus allies to the US in particular, and then also to particular US companies to some extent as well.
And what if the industrial explosion happens in China?
I think I'd say the same in reverse, except actually more plausible that China kind of outgrows to a more significant extent because they've got more top-down
that's why
kind of control. It's more plausible that they just realize the logic and they're like, let's just like absolutely internalize everything and then outgrow the world. It's also kind of more the Chinese economic philosophy is to like be autarkic. So I think, conditional upon China winning the industrial explosion, it does become more likely that there's like a more significant kind of industrial dominance that happens.
One piece of this that I'm aware of is that we've been talking as if it's just like this big kind of industry sludge. And so everyone's on exactly the kind of smooth takeoff of like accelerating growth. But really, technology is lumpy. The most extreme example of this probably is like the development of nuclear weapons, which was a big leap forward in terms of the destructive power of at least of any single weapon. And so really when we're thinking about speeding through or like, very rapidly all these new technologies, we should actually be thinking about something kind of more jagged. And so in some cases then, okay, great. If you're skeptical of this.
I think I agree with the conclusion, but overall, I don't think technology is that lumpy. I think on the whole, it's lots of very small contributions, and overall, it's very smooth. But occasionally, you get a big lump. I think quite rarely, but occasionally. And I think we're going through the whole industrial explosion and the whole technology explosion that follows, then I think there probably will be some big lumps. Probably the case of nuclear weapons isn't the kind of the final time that ever happens. And that, it doesn't, then your argument would still go through in that, okay, at some point, the leading country gets this kind of like fairly breakthrough technology. And that could, suddenly give it an outsized advantage before the rest of the world develops it as well.
Yeah. I mean, even in the case of nuclear weapons, so Kathy Grace at AI Impacts looked into historical case studies of discontinuous technological development. And with nuclear weapons, the cost per amount of destructive power, I've forgotten what the unit is, but, TNT equivalent, was actually pretty smooth, like smoothly declining. So nuclear weapons were these really big bombs, but they were very expensive as well at the time. I also do think there's a bit of like rewriting of history in terms of like creating this kind of bright line around nuclear weapons, given kind of advocacy around it, where, more people in Japan died in the firebombing of kind of Tokyo, for example, and much more, I think 10 times more than died in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And so we're comparing one single bomb against just lots of conventional weapons. So it was obviously like a big leap forward, but one is like perhaps less of a, qualitative jump than you might think from a distant perspective. And then secondly, there is the thought of like, it's unusual that there's actually just this kind of qualitative distinction in nature between chemical energy and nuclear energy. That's actually a very, nature's normally not quantum in that way.
Yeah.
I wish I had a better memory from this AI Impact project. I remember there were some cases of discontinuous progress, but yeah, normally it's a little less.
Yeah, there's like sending messages where it's like at some point you're able to like do it via some kind of radio signal.
Yeah.
And then
it's much faster.
Much faster going transatlantic. Yeah.
However, even suppose it's not qualitative like technological leap. Nonetheless, quantity can be a form of quality where, let's say we're just talking about number of robot soldiers we each have, where, perhaps if you have twice as many as me, then actually it's going to be really quite costly for you to attack me, and you don't really want to do that. But if you have 10 times as many as me, then you can just completely destroy me and you sustain very few damages. Like that's true for human, typically in like in human wars. At least I don't know so much about kind of modern warfare, but more like classic. Yeah, if you and I are like in a fight, then maybe it's equal. If there's two of us, well, maybe you can really harm us. But if I've got 10 of me, 10 of my guys are just against you, you're not even going to get a single punch in. And the similar can be true for like riflemen and so on.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, that argument still requires, the US to get 10 times as many robots as, say, China, which does come back to this kind of smooth curve. They'd have to essentially outgrow China industrially.
But perhaps it doesn't need to be as extreme as 10 times. Maybe if it's just twice as much.
Well, twice as much, I'm skeptical. I think a stronger argument here is just to be like, look, twice as many robots, you're probably not going to crush China, I'd have thought. But, 2x the GDP maybe corresponds to 20, 30 years of tech progress. And if we, in fact, imagine twice as many robots and the technology of 30 years into the future, then I could see that being very decisive. I'm not a military historian at all, but from what I've read, like new technologies are like, very, very overpowered compared to old ones often. And so that that can mean even if it's a totally smooth kind of super exponential growth curve, and even if the US only ever gets to 3 times or 2 times ahead of it compared to China, that's still many decades of tech advantage. That could be enough for one country to completely dominate another country.
Yeah, I mean, a great question that I'd love someone to look into is take a country and imagine it going to war with itself 30 years ago. How close a match is it? Where, yeah, my guess is that in general, looking over the course of history, at least since the rates of technological development kind of increased, it was decisive. And that the last 70 years post-nuclear weapons, when, in fact, I mean, the US has fewer nuclear weapons than it did
right
30 years ago, is quite an unusual point of time. But yeah, that's...
Yeah. Okay, so backing up, all this is to say that we had this whole discussion about whether you could outgrow the world, and it seemed like plausibly, yeah, there's going to be a lot of concentration of economic power. In fact, the overall amount of concentration of power and military power overall is probably going to be, a fair amount more extreme than what we've been discussing.
I originally wanted to have that as the takeaway because, well, maybe there's this, like technological breakthroughs.
Or just smooth tech progress that, 30 years is a lot.
Yeah, smooth tech progress, but where, you being, twice as big as me means you can totally destroy me. However, I actually think it's not clear at all that's the way the upshot goes, because like if there just is some offensive technology that you can't defend against, then even if I have nuclear weapons, then, and you can't defend against them, so you don't have missile defense, which is a very concrete technology that would annul this, then now, even if you're 100 times bigger than me, or at least could be, well, I have this meaningful power, and probably as a result, there would be some de facto trade or redistribution of economic power.
That's right, but I think the situation with nukes is quite unusual in terms of how much a smaller power can still hang on. And if we're imagining going through a large technology explosion, we only need to pass through a portion of it where that was no longer the case. And we return to the historical situation where 30 years tech lead really gives you dominance.
Yeah, great counter argument. So it's defense dominant, but then there's this one offense dominant period, and then if it's the same leader throughout the entire period, then the leader wins at that point.
Right.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Covered a lot of ground here. I've really loved this conversation.
Yeah, it's been super fun.
Like I say, I think the industrial explosion is just... Yeah, maybe I agree with you in what you said at the beginning, that the software-only intelligence explosion is an even bigger deal, even a more important thing to think about. But at the moment, just very few people are thinking through these dynamics, and I wish a lot more were. Yeah,
and I do think especially with the China potentially winning, and I think it would be quite bad if China did win, as I think it's like to just become a dictatorship with one person at the top. I do think a bit more effort thinking through, if there's stuff we could do to avoid that would be good.
Yeah. Well, on that happy note, let's draw this to a close.
Great.
Thanks so much for the conversation, Tom.